Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 299. This is of course the Patreon Drydock, so there's a lot of questions, so we'll just roll straight in with them. Nicholas Ressar asks, what kind of kill-loss ratio would the German U-boats have needed to have a chance at starving out the UK in World War II? Well, it's not so much a kill-loss ratio, I think, as more of just a loss rate, because you could have a really good kill-to-loss ratio, but if those U-boats are being killed very rapidly, then you're going to run out of U-boats, and then the Allies are going to have a bunch of time to rebuild their merchant fleet. Now, what I mean by that is, obviously this is an absurd extreme, but if you had, U-boats with a 100-to-1 kill ratio, but they were also being killed at the rate of 2 or 3 U-boats a day, well, the Allies would run out of merchant ships on the high seas before the month was out, but the Kriegsmarine would also run out of U-boats if they're losing them at the rate of 3 or 4 a day. At which point, as we know, you can build a Liberty ship a heck of a lot faster, and there'd be a little bit of a dicey period, but in theory, the Allies could then put a lot more merchant ships out there a lot faster than the Kriegsmarine could put U-boats out there. But with that said, looking at the loss rates of U-boats and merchant ships, and therefore the approximate kill-to-death ratio, when the U-boats actually came relatively close to starving Britain out in the First World War, and bearing in mind that very approximately the number of ships sunk by U-boats in World War I and World War II is in roughly the same ballpark of magnitude. And Britain obviously has more people in it in the Second World War, and therefore would be under more pressure. We can see that when the U-boats were getting a kill-to-death ratio of about 20-to-1, and losing boats at around about 4 to 5 a month, they were able to put enough pressure on Britain that, as I said, there were assessments in early 1917 where the British were thinking they might be a few months away from having to bow out of the war. So that would be your approximate guide point. And I think that kind of holds true roughly for the Second World War as well. 20-to-1 kill ratio certainly would be very much in favour of the U-boats, but also when you look at U-boat losses per month in the Second World War, much as you look at U-boat losses per month in the First World War, they actually tend to average below 5 per month right up until the very end of 1942, where you get some months which are above it, but not hugely above it, and 1 or 2 that are below. And then you get to maybe about a third of the way through 1943, which is generally when the tide of war is held to have turned against the U-boats. And that's about the time when U-boat losses start to continuously exceed 5 boats per month on a regular basis, and quite a high level above 5 boats per month. So it seems that kind of 5 U-boats lost per month in exchange for, at that point at 2021, approximately 80 to 100 ships, merchant ships sunk, would be what would be needed on a continuous basis to starve out the UK. But that's a very approximate analysis that, as I said, conflates World War I, when the U-boats almost made it, to World War II, where situations are a little bit different, but probably ballpark. Matt Blom asks, I attempted to do some research recently on what error South Dakota had with its electrical switchboard at the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, but I was surprised to learn that her engines broke down beforehand on her first deployment only a couple of weeks after having been declared ready for active duty in July 1942. My question is, with the rushed naval expansion by the US Navy in World War II, was it common for American warships to have major teething troubles right out of commissioning, or were various quality control standards largely upheld in the various shipyards despite the need of speed for expansion? On average, bearing in mind that the average American warship launch during World War II was going to be either a destroyer or a destroyer escort, just through sheer numbers. But more generally speaking, on average, quality control standards were largely upheld. The South Dakota, in particular, was a little bit of a special case. Now, of course, it might look like persistence, considering the problems that North Carolina and Washington had just had, and South Dakota being the next ship being chucked out of the yards in capital ship terms, and still having issues. But there's a number of things that factor into it. Firstly is the fact that South Dakota is a very compact ship, a very compact class, obviously designed to wield the same gun battery as the North Carolinas, but with armour that can actually withstand said guns at reasonable battle ranges. And to do that, obviously they've crammed everything all together, and that in and of itself is going to cause problems of various types, including, of course, the problem she had with her electrical system a bit later on. So she's a little unique in that case. Everything is very much more close to each other, component-wise, than the US Navy typically would have liked. So the fact that there would be various breakdowns of all sorts of systems is not necessarily that surprising. But also, being the first ship of the class, obviously there would be issues that would need to be worked out on her that could then be iterated down into others of the class. I mean, you look at pretty much almost all major class leaders in capital ship terms, Iowa, King George V, etc., and you tend to find they normally have more issues than the subsequent ships in the classes, because any minor design flaws, errors in construction, etc., because you're building a brand new ship and they are very complicated things, will be found and corrected with the first one that goes on trials. Combine that with, if you look at her operational history, South Dakota has a very, very abbreviated shakedown and sea trials period. If you look at North Carolina and Washington, not necessarily fair because, one, they've got those big propeller issues, and two, although the US isn't quite at war yet, they are launched into an active threat environment. So if you wind the clock back a little bit further and look at, say, the Colorados or the Nelsons, they generally go out on their trials, sea trials, shakedown cruise, whatever it is you want to call it, and they seem to last on average about 2.5 to 3.5 months. So that consists of going out, testing things, coming back, fixing the things that didn't quite work, and repeating the process if necessary several times, and of course taking your time to work out every little bug. And then you look at South Dakota, and if you're extremely generous, she has about a month before she's out on active duty, and possibly somewhat less, depending on exactly how you interpret her early operational history. So the fact that some minor issues which might then cause problems, may not therefore be picked up, is not necessarily that surprising. In fact, if you look at the time when she does suffer that engine casualty, I suspect, looking at the timelines and how she was operational, that if she had a more normal shakedown period, that almost certainly would have occurred during the shakedown period and just been written off as, it's a brand new compact ship in a brand new class. This is the kind of thing that happens, fix it and move on. Capitano Lorenzo asks, it's not uncommon today to see undersized cannon ammunition being used with a sabot. Were sabots and other kinds of undersized ammunition used during the age of iron and steam? And if so, whose navy and under what circumstances? I mean, if you want to be really, really nitpicky, then technically almost all smoothbore cannon in the age of sail were saboted, because the diameter of the cannon might be, a third of an inch or more larger than the width of the projectile, and it was, the gap was made up by both the variation in the size of individual projectiles, but also by the wadding, which was stuffed in behind it, which kind of maybe has a sabot-like effect in that it is filling out the barrel to ensure pressure is maintained while the projectile is sent forward, even though this projectile is in and of itself smaller. But more properly, what we would think of as a sabot, as in some kind of solid thing that cups or in some way handles the shell or projectile in order to speed it down the barrel, then being slightly less technically picky, canister shot or grape shot would kind of be sabot rounds, because they are definitely smaller rounds, especially with canister encased in a larger protective thing that, you know, allows the pressure of the explosive in the gun or the propellant to push the projectiles out. But then once you get to explosive shells, early on explosive shells are shot from howitzers and mortars because, well, they're thin, they're fragile, the fuses can get blown out, and etc., and they tend to spin quite wildly. And then they invent these lead sabots, and they work like essentially little cups on the round shells. They're almost Acme style shells earlier on, and that evolves into what you can see here with the more elongated shells of the latter part of the 19th century. They still have this lead semi-cupping sabot at the back, and obviously that is allowing you to have a smaller shell than the barrel. Also, depending on the exact gun, sometimes the lead is also acting kind of like a rifling band, but only where applicable, where the gun itself is rifled. And interesting enough, because obviously back then you're talking about black powder, which is a somewhat violent propellant versus relatively thin-walled shells, there is some talk in period literature about the relatively large quantity of lead actually very slightly absorbing some of the initial kick of the gunpowder and thus elongating the time that that pressure is exerted on the shell, thus making it not shatter into a billion pieces all at once. Sam Signorelli asks, thousands of rounds were expended from anti-aircraft action during an enemy attack. What were the chances of friendly fire from descending shells that hit nothing but air? Or were the ships spread out enough to mitigate this? From the shells themselves, relatively slim, and the reason for that is the bigger shells with longer ranges that might therefore go further, like say 5-inch shells or Bofors 40mm shells, tended to have self-destruct mechanisms built in, where if they went a certain distance, they still hadn't hit anything, they just explode. 20mm, somewhat less so. It depends whose 20mm you're looking at. For example, some German 20mm shells did have a self-destruct system built in, but not all of them. And as far as I can see, the Oerlikon 20mm generally didn't. In fact, there are a few warning notices for some US battleships, like, ironically enough, given what we were talking about a few questions ago, South Dakota, which specifically state, at least in 42-43, the 20mm Oerlikon shell does not have a self-destructive feature. So, in theory, 20mm shells could come plunging down at you. However, there are a few things that mitigate against that. Firstly, as you said, ship spacing, and the fact the 20mm is a relatively short-range weapon, so most 20mm shells that don't hit something are probably going to fall short before they get out to a distance where there might be an escort vessel that might be therefore hit. The larger shells, as we said, have self-destructs, although therefore there would be falling fragments that might hit a friendly vessel, because they're obviously going far enough, but in little bits. And then you've also got the potential, as ships get clustering closer together in the face of certain attacks, that either shells might hit before they hit the absolute range where they would automatically self-destruct, or a shell that doesn't have a self-destruct feature or a malfunctioning one might arc over and hit. But still, you're talking about fire that isn't aimed at a particular vessel, and we all know how difficult it is to hit a ship when you're actually aiming. That's why fire control systems were invented. So if you're firing shells at an aircraft, obviously in a fairly high ballistic arc, and you're not actually aiming to hit a ship that might be halfway or most of the way to the horizon, the odds are you probably wouldn't. The flip side to that is the sheer number of shells mean that even if the odds are very much against you, sooner or later someone is going to be hit. And there are semi-regular records of ships being hit by rounds from other people's anti-aircraft guns. They're not very common. That's why we have these records. They're notable enough to be noted down when they do occur. But it certainly is a risk. I mean, if you go and see HMCS Hyder, there's bits of a superstructure that have patches on them from when they were shot up by 20mm rounds from another vessel. And one or two ships have been, I know I've read about, been hit by 40mm anti-aircraft shells, presumably operating at fairly close ranges. One or two that got hit by spent 5-inch rounds, and so forth. But they're very much the exception that proves the rule. Most of the time you would be fairly safe, albeit that it wasn't an uncommon occurrence to be picking up little bits of destroyed shells after a particularly intense battle and anti-aircraft engagement. Todd Webb asks, what is your opinion on 8 or 9 larger guns versus 12 smaller guns on a battleship? There seems to be quite a lot of people who like 12 when it's the 12 16-inch guns on Montana versus 8 18-inch guns on a Montana or 9 18-inch guns on a Yamato. But there are less in the bigger guns camp when it comes to, say, 12 14-inch guns on a standard class versus 8 16-inch guns on a Colorado. Personally, I think it comes down to what are your guns' expected armor-piercing capabilities at the battle ranges you expect to engage at versus the armor of your current and reasonable near-future potential targets. Because if you have a gun that is perfectly adequate for penetrating current generation targets at reasonable ranges, and your intelligence indicates that the next generation or two of enemy capital ships might be somewhat more heavily protected, but that level of protection is still well within the capabilities of your existing gun to penetrate at least the closer parts of reasonable battle ranges, then I think it makes sense to stick with the smaller gun and just have more of them, because they can do the job of penetrating the opponent, which is their main task, and by having more of them, you are statistically increasing the number of chances you have at actually scoring a hit per salvo. So 12 14-inch guns would work in a standard for most of the 1910s, and if they'd actually built it with them, it almost certainly would have worked perfectly fine for the North Carolina or King George V classes, assuming everybody stuck, roughly speaking, to the treaty limitations or were hilariously bad at engineering ships and therefore built oversized ones that didn't have particularly greater levels of armor protection anyway. The problem comes in where your anticipated targets, or possibly even your current targets, have armor that can actually comfortably deal with your current generation of gun, or in the near future very well might be able to. And at that point, well, it doesn't matter if you have 6, 8, 10, 12, or 16 of that gun. If they can't penetrate the enemy citadel, they are significantly less useful. Therefore, it makes more sense to build a ship with fewer larger guns, because those fewer larger guns will be able to punch through said citadel and actually do their job, even if, statistically speaking, all other things being equal, you might score slightly fewer hits, because those hits will actually matter. Now, of course, whether the evaluation the Navy makes in that respect is actually correct or not is another matter entirely. You know, whether they've actually guesstimated the capabilities of their gun versus the enemy armor and prospective future armor is somewhat irrelevant to the initial calculus of why they've built the ship that way in the first place. So with the Japanese, they were building Yamato, which in theory, as things went, probably would have done better with 12 16-inch guns, but the Japanese were thinking in terms of, one, extremely long distance engagements where they still wanted to have high armor penetration capability, but two, they were also thinking about the next generation or two, i.e. when somebody discovers that the Japanese have built a ship of some description that is larger than the treaty limits, because obviously they're keeping the exact nature very, very secret. So they're thinking, well, if someone thinks we've built a 45,000 ton 16-inch ship, which a lot of people did think they'd done, well, then they might start armouring up against that level, at which point, having 18.1-inch guns, we will still be able to destroy them, which is good. And with the Colorados, they escalated finally. I mean, the US Navy itself actually wanted 16-inch guns much sooner, but looking at the late war designs of the various other powers, it became very clear that pretty soon you were going to have ships that were armoured against 14-inch gunfire. So at which point the Secretary of the Navy could no longer resist the calls for 16-inch guns. There was, however, one other factor which plays into the overall decision back in historical terms, and it is valid. My rule of thumb, as I've just explained, is what I would personally go for, but the other potentially valid way of thinking about it is in terms of space, because especially if you're in World War One, where most people are using only twin turrets, and some of them are using triples, but if you're looking at a situation of we need lots of turrets to throw a certain weight of fire downrange, or we could get rid of at least one turret, but throw even more weight of fire downrange by having bigger guns exploiting the square cube law, that is also another potentially valid way of doing things. At that point, your smaller guns might be perfectly fine at penetrating the enemy armour, and your bigger guns would be perfectly fine at penetrating the enemy armour. That's not so much the question at that stage. The question is more about how much deck space do you want to take up, how much weight of turrets do you want to have, etc., versus how much explosive and metal are you actually delivering to your opponent. Factor that in against the statistical likelihood of scoring a hit with 8 guns rather than 10 or similar, and then you make your call. It's just a little bit more of a complicated call to make than do we have guns that can penetrate current and near future opponents or not. Nathapron Hong Sharon asks, the Italian rebuilds to 12.6-inch guns make them look really good, which begs a question of why didn't they make them like that to begin with? Simply put, if they had built them in the way they refitted them, so triple and a twin forward, triple and twin aft, they would have been considered underpowered for their time. Bearing in mind they were originally built with 12-inch guns, and even the earliest, the Cavours, which was then followed by the Duilios, they were built starting in 1910 and then going forward. The problem is by 1910 the British have already laid down Orion, the first of the super dreadnoughts, with 13.5-inch guns, and Orion has 10 of those. So if Italy has laid down a dreadnought with 10 12-inch guns, because obviously 3 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2 is 10, then they'd be seen as constructing essentially last year's dreadnought. A 10-gun 12-inch broadside is perfectly fine for a second-generation dreadnought, not for a first-gen super dreadnought. Now, the Italians couldn't readily pull a 13.5 or 14-inch gun out of a hat. I'm sure maybe Vickers might have wanted to sell them one, but apparently that didn't go down. So they ended up pretty much taking the same approach that the Brazilians took with Rio de Janeiro, which then later became the Ottoman Sultan I Evil, which then became HMS Agincourt, which was essentially, well, if we can't build a ship that can match the latest generation in firepower for size, we'll just put more guns on. In Agincourt's case, that was 14 12-inch guns in 7 twin turrets, and in the Italians' case, that involved sticking another turret amidships, so they actually had 13 guns, only one off of Agincourt, and therefore they thought, well, with a 3-gun advantage over a super dreadnought, they might stand a chance in battle. And there wasn't really a huge percentage in making them particularly faster, because that's what the refits did. Apart from boring the guns out to make them a 12.6-inch, they took out the centre turret. Obviously, there's bow extensions and other stuff, but essentially the centre turret came out, more machinery went in, and they got a lot faster. But that was with 1930s grade machinery. If they'd done essentially what you see on screen with early 1910s machinery, yes, they would have been faster, but they wouldn't have been massively faster, and therefore a few knots of additional speed versus their comparatively light armour and a substandard for the period broadside would have seen them viewed very unfavourably. DM Phoenix asks, what's the point of a Naval Ensign or Navy Jack flag? Why not just use the national flag of the ship's country of origin? Many Jacks bear no resemblance to their national origin and may contribute to misidentification. Others are just plain ugly. Also, air forces and armies all bear their national flags. Why is there an exception for some navies? So there's a few different things here. Air forces, essentially, the answer is they're far too new. And most of what we're about to discuss, therefore, doesn't really apply to them because they only came into existence in the last century or so. Armies, to a certain extent, almost all also follow the same pattern, at least in terms of national level armies. They tend to post-date the formation of state navies, if for no other reason than having a standing army was an incredibly expensive undertaking, and therefore, at least in terms of continuous holding of a state-maintained permanent army, that's a relatively recent development, not as recent as air forces, but recent enough. And actually, the kind of stuff we're going to discuss with ensigns and jacks and so forth in a minute actually kind of did happen with armies back when they were mostly private, raised by various feudal lords or by a king in his personal capacity and that kind of thing. And it's only once they move over to being entities of the state, which obviously happens in the UK with the Cromwellian period and in various other nations, sometimes from their founding, like with the US Army, or with various other developments, such as the French Revolution. At that point, there's enough developed nationalism and a actual continuity of national ensigns or flags for them to adopt that. But prior to that, you'd have all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. Now, coming on to the navies, the distinction between a jack and an ensign, at least as far as I understand it, is that the Navy Jack pretty much is almost continuously flown from a ship. The Naval Ensign, different navies do have different traditions, but the Naval Ensign may only be flown during the day, or depending on where you hoist it, what size you hoist it at, or the particular naval tradition, may also only be hoisted in times of war. But that there is a restriction in some way, shape, or form around the hoisting of the ensign, at which point you need some way of distinguishing the ship that's not that. And that's done partly because the jack is usually smaller, well, it is smaller, but it's also often a different shape. Very often jacks are square. And obviously, if you have a different jack to your naval ensign, that's very definitely says that this ship is not undertaking a specific action that might otherwise be considered hostile. Like, for example, the Royal Navy obviously has the tradition. Nowadays, it has the white ensign. The white ensign flies during the day, so it's colours, and it's brought down at night. If the white ensign is seen flying aboard a Royal Navy ship at night, that means that the ship is at war. And the Royal Navy nowadays has the tradition that at the outbreak of war, the white ensign is hoisted, and it doesn't come down again until war is over. Now, deceptive practices practiced during the Age of Sail mean obviously this isn't a long continuous thing, but the general principle of you may not always be flying your ensign is there. The jack allows you to have something else that can't be mistaken for your ensign that still identifies who you are, as long as you want to be identified or need to be identified. And having a jack as distinct from your ensign can be very important if you're flying your national flag, because your national flag not only carries permutations of the honour of your naval service, also carries permutations of the honour of your country. And therefore, if there are rules within your navy that say there are certain times and places where you should be flying your ensign if it's the national flag, you definitely don't want to be potentially accused of breaking those. Hence why you quite often have distinct differences. Now, with the naval ensign, the ensign tends to be more likely to be the national flag the younger the Navy is, and less likely to be the national flag the older the Navy is. Now, there are some cases where this isn't the case, because there's been some kind of major societal upheaval at some point along the line, like, say, for the Marine Nationale. But more broadly speaking, way back, if you're going back to a Navy that has had a permanent position since the Age of Sail, or at least the mid to early Age of Sail, firstly, that Navy may well have been the personal property of the sovereign and not technically the property of the state as a whole, and therefore would have a tradition of flying a different flag to the national flag. Secondly, back in those times, you could have national flags that were actually relatively easy to confuse, which might lead to the search for a different ensign as well. And also in some navies, the ensigns served as a form of signalling in and of themselves, like with the Royal Navy, where you had the red ensign, which you can see here, the blue ensign and the white ensign, which were used to denote which part of the fleet you were supposed to be in for a while. At least until the Royal Navy outgrew that particular designation. And therefore you need something that is not your national flag that you can adapt to potentially have multiple different variants of your ensign. And then, as time goes on, tradition might change, but if you have a fairly strongly established tradition, you will probably round down to one version of your ensign, but not change that to your national flag, which is what the Royal Navy did with the white ensign, which contains the national flag but is not the national flag. Then you get into separate things about exclusivity for the Navy. If you have a national flag for all ships that belong to your country, then there could be some confusion, especially in the Age of Sail, between is this a merchant ship or is this a warship? And that actually has quite a lot of importance when you get to the latter period of time, when you start to enter the 20th century, in terms of cruiser warfare and the rules of cruiser warfare. If a ship, let's say if Britain had standardized and said everyone flies the Union Jack, well then, from looking at a basic visual inspection from a distance, is that a Royal Navy transport? Is that, and therefore a warship, or at least an armed vessel in service, or is that a regular merchant ship? You don't know. And if you attack it, well, if it is a warship, you are under license, if you're a U-boat, to just blow it out of the water without warning. But if it's a merchant ship, you're supposed to haul up and say, hi, please allow me to inspect your ship, or just leave your ship because I'm going to sink it now. Whereas if you have the red ensign on a British merchant ship and the white ensign on a Royal Navy warship, it makes that distinction a lot easier. And sometimes that can loop back round to, avoiding confusion, because the number of people over time who have seen a photograph in black and, in color it would be a little bit easier to distinguish, but at least in black and white photos, or from, let's say, from a distance, etc., people who have seen photos of, say, a Gangut class and gone, why is that Gangut class flying the Union Jack? Why is it flying a British flag? Well, it's not. It's flying the Imperial Russian Navy Jack, which just so happens in black and white to very closely resemble the Union Jack. Christian Bugenberg asks, how were ships moved around in harbour before the advent of steam-powered tugs? Did they use rowboats, for example? Most of the time, bearing in mind that the first steam tugboats came about in the very early part of the 19th century, ships just kind of did it themselves, because the vast majority of them were small enough and handy enough that, assuming the wind was in vaguely the right direction, they could sail themselves into harbour as near as they needed to be. And once they got close enough to the dock, then they could just throw lines out or send one of their boats across with a line to do the final bit of manoeuvring if they needed to. There was a fairly fine art to all of this. And if they needed to move around inside the harbour from stationary, then again, they could either just wait for the wind to get up, or they could get their own boats to row them about, or they could maybe get a harbour boat or two to help pull them along, or they could engage in a practice known as kedging, which involves putting one or more of the ship's anchors on one or more of the ship's boats, and then that boat takes the anchor a little distance out, drops it, And then once you make sure the anchor is secure, you use the capstan to essentially wind yourself towards that particular location, which you can use if there isn't any wind or if the wind is against you. And that's actually what Drake and Hawkins used in the Battle of San Juan de Ulua to maneuver themselves out of the Spanish trap that was set. So there were various options available before a tugboat, most of which involved a mixture of the ship and its boats. Andrew Dederer asks, Chesapeake ended up as a mill, Resolute has done more terms in the White House than any president, and Erebus and Terror have mountains, etc. named for them at both ends of the earth. What's your call for the most interesting or unusual or obscure ship legacy name worldwide? Well, there's a series of very, very deep places on Earth named after the ships that discovered them, the Challenger Deep being the most obvious one. But also you have the Diamantina Deep, which was discovered by HMS Diamantina, which, I mean, it makes a certain degree of sense, but also it's a little bit odd because, of course, that's the one place a ship doesn't want to be. If you go around the UK, you'll find a fairly wide number of pubs and so forth that still carry legacy names from ships, either ships that are generally famous or perhaps ships that the original pub owner served in at one point, or even ships that the pub was built from. And a slightly obscure, if possibly slightly tangential one, would be the country of Senegal, which, at least according to some sources, is named after a canoe, or more specifically, the River Senegal was accidentally named after a canoe, which was then adopted into the name of the entire country. Quite how that came about is a story that it repeats itself more often than it should, because you'd think people would have learned better after the first couple of mistakes. But essentially, European trader shows up. European trader says, "Oi, mate, what's this place?" The locals going, "What is he speaking?" And then someone going, "Well, by the gestures, he seems to want to know what this is," but they interpret this as in this thing that, we are on or in the immediate proximity of, and they're in a canoe, so they go, "Well, we're in our canoe," and in the local language, and then the European goes, "Aha, clearly this is the name of," well, in that particular case, the river, and then they eventually decided, well, if the river's called that, we might as well call the local area that, and thus the country of Senegal. So although it's not named after a specific ship, it is, amusingly enough, an entire country named after a type of water-going vessel. Molly Madison asks, while reading through a list of US Navy ship losses in the Second World War, I came across this entry. June 30th, 1943, the 9,600-ton transport McCawley sunk in error by US motor torpedo boats in the Blanche Channel between Rendover and New Georgia in the middle of the Solomons, after having been torpedoed by Japanese aircraft earlier that day. Was this the same McCawley that Admiral Turner used as his flagship, and what is the story behind her erroneous sinking? Yep, that would be the same McCawley, USS McCawley APA-4, as seen here. She was indeed Admiral Turner's flagship at the start of the Guadalcanal invasion. In the interim, she served as, a transport shuttling troops and supplies back and forth, both initially to Guadalcanal and then to other islands as the campaign continued. But Admiral Turner was still aboard her when she was attacked. In fact, there had been several threatened air attacks during the day. Nothing had come about. But then, after having landed her most recent batch of supplies, the ship was on its way back out to sea when it was attacked by Japanese torpedo bombers along with other vessels, and she took a torpedo hit to the engine room. Now, at that point, being dead in the water, Admiral Turner left, and they spent most of the rest of the day trying to salvage the ship, but they seem to have given it up as a bad idea as the draft was just increasing and increasing as more and more flooding came in aft towards the end of the day. Now, it's not entirely clear whether that was a case of, as with Hornet, just leaving the ship because it was clearly on its way down and there was night approaching, therefore potentially further Japanese interference, or whether it was a case of, our salvage efforts are not having the desired effects, and it's much, much harder to recover people either from a sinking ship or from the water at night, so pulling them off at night and then maybe with an intent to go back the next day and try and fix things up then. Obviously, the situation would have gotten worse during the night, but it's safer to be off the ship than on it. But whatever the case, while the sun had set, and then a few hours later, the ship was just randomly hit by a bunch of torpedoes and sank fairly quickly thereafter. And then the next day, some PT boats who hadn't been told that there were still friendly ships in the area rocked up and were like, "Hey guys, we sank an enemy target last night." And everyone else was like, "Well, there weren't any enemy targets in this area last night." Oh. Ah. Right. Okay. Awkward shuffling of feet. And then they decided, well, maybe, just maybe, the various combat sections of the US Navy operating in this area should maybe talk to each other. Glenn Ricafrente asks, what are 10 of your favourite badass quotes from naval figures in the middle of battle or about to go into battle? Well, I think in terms of pure aggression, the signal from Admiral Cunningham when the blockade of Tunisia was started probably has to take the biscuit, even though, as it turned out, there wasn't actually a huge amount of action, just a couple of transports sunk by fast attack craft. But he opened the blockade with the signal, sink, burn and destroy, let nothing pass, which must have been so cathartic for him after several years of back and forth with the Axis forces in the Mediterranean. And, you know, despite the fact that the Italian fleet didn't materialise to try and save the Axis forces in Tunisia, it wasn't for lack of the Allies being ready. I mean, both Nelson and Rodney were waiting in the wings to throw down with the Italians should they emerge, so it could have been a rather spectacular battle. Another one which requires quite a bit of context is Admiral Hawke's signals to start the Battle of Quiberon Bay. He hoisted the signals for general chase and full sail. Now, that might not seem like a particularly significant thing to do, but there's a few little pointers for this. Firstly, general chase is not hoisted by the Royal Navy very often at all, because it essentially releases all ships from any kind of formation or other orders to make best speed to engage the enemy as they will, which normally means you hoist that at the end of a battle when your opponent is very definitely beaten. To hoist it at the start of a battle or to initiate a battle is a absolutely supreme show of confidence in your prospects for victory. And the reason that's followed up by full sail is because, as when I eventually get around to covering the Battle of Quiberon Bay, you'll understand more fully, Quiberon Bay should not have happened. Quiberon Bay happened because Hawke was an absolute lunatic who decided that, stuff the line of battle apart from a few ships who are very close to him. We're just going in full bore, all sails set, riding a storm into confined narrow shoal waters, which we don't actually have any decent charts for. And our main plan for not smashing into the shoal waters is follow the French, because they do know where they're going and presumably don't want to commit suicide. Although it was written down before battle, Admiral Nelson had to touch for the dramatic quotes several times, but one of the best ones was shortly before the Battle of Copenhagen, at least the one that he led. He actually wrote in a letter back home, "A fleet of British ships at war are the best negotiators," which is as grandiose and bellicose a line as ever, to the point that when they were writing the rulebook for Battlefleet Gothic, Games Workshop just changed British to Imperial, and it fits perfectly within the universe. The abbreviated quote by Admiral Farragut, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." I mean, that pretty much encapsulates everything that needs to be said about that. And likewise, Admiral Dewey at the Battle of Manila, "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." Also slightly paraphrased into Star Wars, I think, when Grand Moff Tarkin is ordering the destruction of Alderaan. Then you've got from Spain, Blas de Liezo, apparently is attributed as saying it in one of his battles, "Tell my children that I died like a good Basque, armed and defending the integrity of Spain and the Empire. Fire." Which is made all the more hilarious by the fact that Blas de Liaison is one of the few people who can claim to have been wounded and lost more limbs than Nelson and still remained upright. While it was immediately after battle, I do absolutely have to tip my hat to the French Admiral Surcouf, a British naval officer, rather unwisely challenged him and said, "You French fight for money while we fight for honour." Surcouf just said, "Well, each of us fights for what he lacks most," at which point I think that particular argument went in Surcouf's favour. Admiral de Ruyter certainly gets one. He called out to his sailors, "Courage, my children, and the victory is ours," which is a pretty good quote in and of itself. The fact that he said that shortly after he'd been hit by a cannonball that broke both his legs, yeah, it takes a special something to pull that off. And much as I think John Paul Jones overall was probably not the world's best naval commander, considering he managed to get half his own fleet to shoot at him because they hated him so much, you got to admit he had a nice turn of phrase. And no, I'm not going to go for the obvious one, but in his battle with HMS Serapis, he is known to have said, "I may sink, but I'm damned if I'll strike," which, is pretty good. But I think it has to cap off with going back to Admiral Cunningham again during the evacuation of Crete. And again, context is necessary. So the Royal Navy is taking a bit of a battering at this point. They don't have carrier support. They're under heavy attack by German and Italian aircraft, whilst mostly being confined in their operational environment because they've got to cover the evacuation and help indirectly the evacuation of the Allied troops on Crete. Ships are being sunk, ships are being badly damaged, and by all accounts, sensibly, perhaps the Royal Navy should withdraw to conserve its strength. One of his officers suggests that to him, and while bombs are raining down, Cunningham just turns around and says, "It takes the Navy 3 years to build a ship. It will take 300 years to build a new tradition, and the evacuation will continue." Fireteam Joker asks, "The British toyed with the idea of making an aircraft carrier out of ice in World War II with Project Habbakuk. In theory, an artificial mobile island could have provided unique tactical options in Europe and the Pacific. Why was this never followed through with?" A variety of factors. Partially cost and expense, because although the by volume largest amount of the Habbakuk carrier was going to be Pikecrete, so this combination of sawdust and ice, it was going to be built around a steel frame, and there would be steel reinforcements and elements of steel in the flight deck and things like this. On top of that, obviously, while the cost per unit volume would be relatively low, there is a lot of volume and it would take a while to produce. So there would have to be industrial resources put towards it that would take time and effort. And if it wasn't strictly needed, those resources could be put towards other things. And that follows on to the second part, which is, did they actually need it? At the time the idea was conceived, the main problem was U-boats in the mid-Atlantic, and that was the first problem Habbakuk was supposed to solve. By the time testing and preliminary design had been done for the materials and the concept, longer-ranged aircraft had largely closed the mid-Atlantic gap, along with the implementation of the loosely named escort-support groups. And so, well, if a bunch of relatively cheap sloops and relatively cheap aircraft can deal with the major problem, then you don't need to spend months manufacturing a giant ice carrier, and you can use it on other ships that can be more quickly finished and are more readily applicable to more situations. Now, that wasn't the end of the Habbakuk planning, though. What a lot of people, and indeed quite a lot of sources, don't seem to know, and I've only found this out through doing National Archives research myself, along with my good friend Frank Blazich, who's done a lot of work looking at basically what came after, what grew out of the Habbakuk project. The idea of Habbakuk generally kept coming up again as more problems were identified that could be solved by a gigantic floating ice carrier. In the Pacific, it doesn't seem that Habbakuk was ever really seriously considered, because by the time the British were seriously looking at going into the Pacific, not only did they have quite a few conventional carriers of their own, but of course the Americans had the Essex swarm and lots of island bases, although they did look at floating airfields that were derived in part from Habbakuk's work, but they weren't mobile. They were essentially modular floating airfields that could be fixed in place in various locations, perhaps without atolls and islands that didn't have surfaces that were conducive to putting down runways in and of themselves. But one of the more interesting little sidelines in the Habbakuk research in mid to late 43, early 44, was they were looking at how to get aircraft to Europe, because for patrol aircraft, this was one thing, but if you were trying to get bombers, B-17s, and fighters, P-51s, P-47s, over to Europe, you were either flying a rather looping route over Greenland and Iceland so that you had places to stop and refuel and places to crash land if something went wrong, or you were having to go quite far south, basically down North America, across the Caribbean, South America, across at the narrowest point of the Atlantic, and work your way back up Africa and Western Europe. Now, that wasn't great in the early part of, late part of 43, early part of 44, and then once you got to mid-late 44, once D-Day's taken off, it's still not a fantastic route because it's very long, but there wasn't really anywhere mid-Atlantic where aircraft could just take off from, say, the middle of the US East Coast and head directly for the UK. And someone pointed out, this Habbakuk thing, if we build that, we could station that in the mid-Atlantic, and that could act as a stopover, rest, and refuel point for these aircraft. And it would work perfectly fine for fighters, even P-51s, not adapted for carrier landings because it was so big. The US Air Force wrote back and essentially said, yeah, it's all very well putting 1,000-foot runway out there for us, but we want 6,000 feet for our B-17s for whatever reason, and essentially use this as an excuse to stop their involvement in the project, except for there's a rather interesting note that came back from the British side that just said, well, you know what, if you want a 6,000-foot long ice carrier, you can have a 6,000-foot long ice carrier. It'll just take us an extra month to manufacture the additional modules we need to bolt onto it. There doesn't seem to have been a reply from the US Air Force or US Army Air Force at that stage. And whether or not the British were entirely serious or just tweaking the Americans' noses and calling their bluff is something I need to hunt down further, because, the concept of a 6,000-foot long floating ice carrier is quite amusing to me. And for reference, that is a ship that would have been 4 times the length of the Yara Viking, Seawise Giant, Knocknevis, whatever it happened to be called at the time, the longest ship that's ever actually been built in the world, the ultra-large carrier, crude carrier, or if you want to measure it in something like, say, USS Enterprises, the CBN-65, it's just a fraction shorter than 6 nuclear-powered supercarriers end-to-end. I have a feeling you could probably take off and land a B-17 or 2 on that thing. Avoid Shisnos asks, in Thunder Below, Admiral Flucky recounts the issues he faced with the Mark 18 torpedoes. Was this widely reported by others across the fleet, and what were the causes of these failures? Yeah, the Mark 18 had quite a lot of issues that were quite widely reported across the fleet, and people really, really weren't happy with them. Basically, anyone who got issued a Mark 18 would run into problems sooner rather than later. And some of those problems could be pretty lethal. For example, it didn't have any protection against a circular run. So at least USS Tang and possibly quite a few other US subs fell victim to their own torpedoes just deciding to loop back on them. Within the scope of an answer you can fit into a Drydock, the essential problem with the Mark 18 was that some of the German G7E electric torpedoes had washed up, and the people in charge of US torpedo development, who, bear in mind, had brought you the endless cavalcade of hilarity that is the Mark 14, had decided, well, we have an electric torpedo, so it is much quieter, it's weightless, so it's harder to spot and harder to work out where it came from. This is a good thing if we can get some of these into our subs, because it'll make them less likely to be hit or detected. which is all well and good. They're perfectly right in that assumption, except for they should have just gone, here is the G7E with a US flag draped over it. What they did was, well, this is the G7E, the pinnacle of mid-World War II torpedo technology, at least in the electrically propelled torpedo field. I'm sure we can improve on it. Spoiler alert, they could not, in fact, improve upon it. The various changes they made to try and make it better, in general, actually made it worse. And on top of that, there was the other issue, which was that, in keeping with quite a lot of German Wunderwaffe of the Second World War, the G7E did work, but it worked because it had to be manufactured to extremely high tolerances. The German engineering tolerances. The problem was that the manufacturing production lines for torpedoes that the US had at the time did not possess vast numbers of extremely highly trained precision engineers who could make sure the thing was built to absolutely precise standards every single time. There was a degree of mass manufacture involved, but also a degree of handcrafted finishing to make sure everything was tuned just so. Now, that's not to say the US didn't possess highly skilled precision engineers manufacturing their torpedoes. They did, but they didn't make up the majority of the workforce. The majority of the workforce had, for understandable reasons, been brought in and trained up very quickly to mass manufacture wartime products. This was part of one of the many problems with the Mark 14 initially. They had to massively expand production lines. And that meant little bits and pieces that should have been absolutely right on target really weren't. And that contributed further to breakdowns. I mean, you had things up to the circular run problem. Sometimes the batteries would start, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes the torpedo would roll itself over and dump the battery acid out, which would cause it to stall and basically die. Other times the torpedo would refuse to start. Sometimes it wouldn't go as far as it should have done. Sometimes it would go far too quickly because the batteries weren't insulated well enough. And the list goes on. The Rogue Chief asks, at the risk of asking a question that's already been done, if the Essex-class carriers proved so much better at handling American aircraft than the British carriers could, why didn't the Royal Navy order some American Essexes to go with their American planes? Was it a similar case to my previous question about no British Iowas and the US just wasn't going to let go of any of them, or was there any other factors? There were a few factors, one of which was that, by the time the Essexes were even entering service and the Royal Navy was receiving substantial numbers of American aircraft, as opposed to, a few martlets here and there, which they had initially, by that point, the Royal Navy had quite a bit of experience in what could happen to an aircraft carrier in contested waters in places like the Mediterranean, and the idea of an unarmoured flight deck was essentially a non-starter for the UK. They had to accept it with things like the escort carriers, but the escort carriers were never supposed to fight on the front line. If you were going to fight on the front line, as far as the Royal Navy was concerned, you needed an armoured flight deck because they, within fairly decent justification, concluded that if you'd put Yorktown, or indeed Essex, in a position that HMS Illustrious had been in the Mediterranean, that ship would have been on the bottom very, very quickly. And before anyone jumps in, no, having more fighters wouldn't have saved them because, look at when Illustrious was bombed, look at the timeline, realise at that point the chances of any substantial number of US fighters or any US fighters actually intercepting the incoming strike are slim to none. Because once again, reference late 1942, Guadalcanal, 50 Wildcats hovering over the fleet, and they've completely failed to intercept the Japanese attack because flight control direction sucks. So basically, the Essexes didn't meet the survivability characteristics that the Royal Navy reckoned they needed in an aircraft carrier. On top of that, you have the fact the Essexes are running the high-pressure steam plants that most US ships did, and that would require a whole lot of retraining for British engineering crews who obviously were working with what was, generally speaking, the Royal Navy's lower pressure steam plants, and that would introduce further delays into entry into service and prevent a certain degree of interchangeability. And then you have to look at what you mentioned in the question and what we led off with, which is, would the US actually even give any of them up? Bearing in mind that at the beginning of 1943, when the Essexes, or the first Essex, is just coming online, the US Navy has lost 4 fleet carriers. Okay, so they're down Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp, and Lexington. Enterprise has been battered really badly and is going to be temporarily out of action. So they're temporarily down 5 carriers. And once Enterprise comes back out, Saratoga will probably need an overhaul. So for the medium term, they essentially need to replace 5 fleet carriers just to be back at the strength they would have been at the start of the war. And remember, at this point, the Japanese still have Shikaku and Zuikaku around. There's the Hio and Junyo, which collectively maybe could add up to the collective aircraft power of another fleet carrier. And the Japanese have a bunch of smaller, quick conversions floating around as well. But essentially, there's a bit of an uphill struggle to climb. Now, obviously, the Kido Butai doesn't have anywhere close to the number of aircraft carriers it did prior to Midway, but they still have more than the Americans do at this point. So even if we just look at the commissioning dates, and bearing in mind commissioning is a few months out from actual active service, of the first 5 Essex class, sure, Essex is available pretty much at the start of 43. And then you've got Lexington in February 43, Bunker Hill in May, Yorktown in April, and then Intrepid in August. So now you're kind of back up to your pre-war strength, but by the time Intrepid actually gets fully stuck into action, you're looking at late 43. Hornet, although she commissions in 43, is probably not going to be available until 44. So you're looking at a Wasp, obviously, as well in late 43. So you're not really looking at having any significant advantage over your pre-war fleet until really you've gotten into the first few months of 1944, and at that point obviously the Japanese brought in Taiho and a few of their other hodgepodge conversions. So the US Essex swarm, although it starts arriving in 43, really doesn't start to run away with things until maybe the end of the first third of 1944, and then obviously it grows and grows and grows from there. But the US is not going to give up any Essexes really before that, and even then it would take quite a while to pry one off of them after. And even if they were willing to give the Royal Navy 1 or 2, or let the Royal Navy purchase off them 1 or 2 of the Essexes that were due to commission in mid to late 1944, as I mentioned, with the having to retrain the engineers and so forth, and just familiarise everyone with the ship, you're probably looking at it not entering Royal Navy service until maybe the second quarter of 1945, at which point the war is almost over, and you've got the other issues about survivability that I mentioned. So it's not worth the British asking, and the Americans almost certainly wouldn't have given them one anyway. Hamilcar Barker asks a 1-sentence question: when or where will your paper on the sinking of Hood be available? And slightly longer, what was the damage to Graf Spee that prevented her from sailing out? Different books have it as the water plant, the diesel plant, and the kitchen. Which one was it? With the Hood paper, I'm hoping later this year. I had wanted to get it out from sort of middle of last year, but a couple of things intervened. Firstly, I found even more information about specifically the US Navy discovering pretty much the exact weakness that I hypothesized for Hood being present on the North Carolina class, and having to make a whole bunch of minor changes at the very last minute to that ship's design, which meant I had to go back and incorporate that information at various relevant points in the paper. So that therefore we needed a little bit of a rewrite. But then on top of that, as some of you who watch the live streams at least will be aware, I also had to deal with getting the house ready for the arrival of Mini Drac, the baby Drac, and then obviously said arrival of baby Drac and the sleeplessness that I'm sure all parents know comes with the first couple of months of having a baby around. which has meant that I've basically had to be focusing on keeping the channel going and not really had a chance to do the final edits I want to do to the paper, but hopefully I will have that time soon. Now, with Graf Spee, and as you can see here, this is Graf Spee sporting her fake turret. And in terms of her damage that in the end, amongst other things, potentially would have prevented her from making it home, the answer to what you listed is yes. All of those things. For different reasons. So some of her food supply was contaminated and some of the storage compartments flooded as a result of hits. Now, to be fair, they could have, in theory, bought in a bunch of new food to replace the stuff that had been lost, although they would have had to find somewhere else to store it. In terms of the water treatment and diesel purification and preheating plants, what appears to be the case from the damage control assessments and so forth written up in the aftermath of the battle is that these were powered by auxiliary boilers, and the auxiliary boilers had taken hits. Now, different assessments of how damaged those were depends partly on which testimonies from which members of the crew you believe and how you interpret the after action report that was written up. But if you were being generous, then the power supply to those plants had been damaged. The damage had been patched, but it was possible that that damage might fail, or the patching might fail while the ship was at sea. Or if you're a little bit more, doomsaying, critical, etc., you can also interpret the compilation of reports from the crew and the damage control itself as saying that the boilers were non-operational, potentially with the diesel purification and water plants themselves may be damaged by fragments and splinters because they weren't too far away, and that whatever the case, whether the actual plants themselves were destroyed or just their power supply, they weren't operational, and therefore the ship would have had to go with whatever water they had aboard at the time and then run out or loot. And with the diesel, it wouldn't necessarily have been a problem initially because they were in a very warm environment, so diesel would have been relatively warm, and of course they had a certain amount that had been purified. But the further along they went, especially if they went into colder waters, the more and more the lack of preheated and purified diesel would have scuppered the engines, and then they really would have been in for it. So it's a combination of all these factors, plus of course the massive British propaganda effort that convinced Langsdorff that HMS Renown was hovering over the horizon. Nick Brodar asks, what was the best general purpose World War II destroyer? If we limit ourselves to classes of ship that saw action in the majority of the Second World War, because otherwise you end up with ships where, one or two of the class technically commissioned before the end of the war and stuff like that, at which point you're talking about a whole new generation of ships which would easily grab the title of Best General Purpose World War II Destroyer purely by dint of being so much more advanced than their predecessors, but also basically didn't actually have much of a role in World War II. So, with that caveat in mind, i.e. a ship that has to have at least one vessel of the class running for at least half the war, you've got to go with the Fletchers. The Fletchers are not the absolute best destroyers in every single regimen. There are destroyers that are a little bit more handy than them. There are destroyers that certainly would have a significant advantage over a Fletcher in a gun action, tribal class, for example. There are destroyers that carry a lot more torpedoes than them. There are destroyers that carry better torpedoes than them. That's not actually that high a bar to clear, to be perfectly honest, especially early on in the war. The Mark 15 doesn't have quite the same issues as the Mark 14, but they have some and related issues. So yeah, there's that. And there are one or two ships which arguably might be slightly better at anti-aircraft, but those start to edge dangerously close towards the cutoff point and become sort of late war only destroyers. However, the Fletcher is reasonable at anti-submarine warfare. It's got a decent punch when its torpedoes work. It's got a very good anti-aircraft punch between medium and heavy AA. And it's got a decent anti-surface punch as well, thanks to, well, they have 5 guns which fire fairly quickly, even if the shells are a little bit floaty at longer ranges. And as I've pointed out a few times before, they're also insanely durable for destroyers, thanks to that STS splinter plating along their sides, which, you know, saves a lot of Fletchers from cumulative damage that would have done in a lot of other destroyers. And so, as a general all-rounder, I don't think you can really beat the Fletcher for the destroyer classes that served through a substantial portion of World War II. Jeffrey Conley asks, a Razee'd frigate is an example of a small ship of the line cut down, but benefits from still keeping its big rigging. Did any navy ever turn a second-rate or even a first-rate into a Razee'd frigate? And if so, what were their names, and would these ships benefit more or less compared to smaller ships like HMS Indefatigable? There are only 2 examples of the specific type of conversion you're asking about. There were a number of 3-deckers that were cut down into 2-deckers, but still remain ships of the line. In fact, that got quite common as the first half of the 19th century wore on. But as far as ships of the line that would classify as first or second rates being cut down to frigates, I'm only aware, as I said, of the 2 cases. The first case is this ship you can see here, USS Independence, built right at the end of the War of 1812. Now, ostensibly she was supposed to be a 74-gun third rate, and a 74-gun third rate being cut down into a frigate is not exactly miraculous news. There'd been a bunch that had even been done before she was even launched, and there would be quite a few done afterwards. However, according to some fairly reliable sources, she was actually armed at one point in her career as a ship of the line with 90 guns. And if she was, obviously you've got the 2 main gun decks and then the spar deck, then at 90 guns she would just about be a second rate, and she was later Razee'd down to a frigate. So that would be one. The other one would be HMS Nelson. Now that is indisputably a case of Razee'ing down to a frigate. She was originally a 120, 126 gun, something along those lines, 3-decker first rate of the Royal Navy. She was then Razee'd. She was actually Razee'd twice. Once down to a 2-decker and given an auxiliary steam power plant, then transferred over to the states that would eventually become Australia, and she spent some time there, and then she was Razee'd again from a 2-decker down to a 1-decker. So she eventually became a frigate, although by that point she was very, very definitely a training and patrol vessel, not a frontline warship. For Independence, she apparently went from being an actually, frankly, quite terrible ship of the line to a really, really good frigate. For Nelson, well, she was so changed by the time she got to her frigate status from what she'd originally been built with. I don't think any comparison is really fair compared to her original performance state. Although, to be fair, the Nelson class ships of the line were not the Royal Navy's best performance ever. Essentially, when you look at the Nelsons and the Caledonias, they're 2 ways of approaching the problem, and one's good, one's not. Caledonia looked at HMS Victory and took inspiration from that, but incorporated a lot of new ideas as well, and resulted in an excellent class. The Nelson class were essentially, what if we take the Victory design and put a hull plug in it and make a 120 gunner? It turns out that doesn't work very well. John McCarthy asks, as a kid, I often wondered why dive bombers didn't just drop their bombs down the funnel, as this is a shortcut to the heart of the ship. I now know that navies used various techniques to prevent such an attack. Could you explain the most common ones? Yep, well, there were 3 main counters to having a bomb drop down your funnel. The first was movement, because, well, even dive bombers, which are much, much more accurate than level bombers, statistically speaking, are more likely to miss the target than hit, and that's when the target is a full-sized warship, not a tiny little hole in the middle of said warship, or 2 holes, perhaps, if it's a particularly fast warship. So, you know, you're talking about a fairly low percentage chance of hitting the ship, and then of that, a low single digit or less percentage of actually hitting the funnel as long as the ship's on the move. Now, some ships were hit straight down the funnel, and it did cause various problems, particularly when they were stationary. And obviously, partly by luck, partly by judgment, a little bit more care could be taken with the aim. But if you were moving, the chances of getting a down the funnel hit were very, very remote. The next bit of safety came from the fact that some, although not all funnels, didn't actually go straight down to the boilers. They might have followed a curve, especially if they were big trunked funnels, where you have multiple boilers feeding into them from different angles, or if the funnel was just raked backwards, as some were. So essentially, there's not a direct path from the top of the funnel down into the depths of the ship. And that could obviously cause a whole load of issues for a bomb, because it would hit the side of the funnel and either punch through out of the funnel into some other portion of the ship and detonate, or just potentially, if it was a general purpose bomb, just detonate on hitting the side of the funnel. And the final element, which I unfortunately don't seem to have any diagrams or pictures to hand immediately, was armoured grates, or an armoured grate or grating in the funnel, because people figured out fairly quickly that this could be a risk. And on ships that were substantially armoured, so most of the down the funnel shots I described were destroyers and other similar light vessels, but on the big ships like cruisers and battleships, either an armoured grate at the armour deck level or multiple grates sometimes were introduced inside the funnels, because obviously you need to have space to let the hot air and other gases out. You can't just have a solid plate. But the idea of the grating was to catch the bomb and force it to detonate higher up in the ship, and that is basically in a manner similar to an armour deck, just with slightly less resistance to fragments. And that's what was initially installed, and then some people did tests in the 30s and went, maybe this one is a bit too low down, and that's where you got some of the later ships with a series of grates, because the first one maybe wouldn't stop the bomb, but much like some bomb decks, the first one would initiate the bomb. If it was a general purpose, i.e. high explosive bomb, then it would detonate the bomb right nice and high up. But if it was a semi-armor piercing or armor piercing bomb, it would at least initiate the fuse, which would then cause the bomb to detonate somewhere higher, further down in the funnel, but still higher up than the main armor grate. And then the main armor grate had more of a chance of catching and slowing down the resulting fragments. Manani Wanderer asks, what was the procedure for dealing with coal bunker fires, and how did it vary between civilian and military vessels? Well, with coal bunker fires, you've got two main elements for dealing with them: prevention and then cure. And that's not just right, there was actually quite a lot of science behind the prevention aspect. But for the curing element, the problem was that usually a coal bunker fire, if it broke out, would be quite deep in the piled coal. So if you do have a coal bunker fire, the primary method of dealing with it on both merchant and war vessels is simply to leave it. Not just ignore it completely and hope it goes away, but to essentially smother it as best you can with other coal for the immediate moment, and then, ironically enough, dig it up again and feed the smouldering coals into a boiler, which will obviously then burn up the fuel, which is what it's supposed to do. If the coal fire develops in a relatively shallow part of the coal stack in the bunker, then of course you can just remove it almost immediately and shovel it. If it gets really bad, then you can spray it down to put it out with water. But the problem is, and this kind of loops now over into the prevention side of things, one of the best ways of preventing coal fires is actually to keep the coal dry, because it's the presence of water and therefore damp coal that actually encourages the various chemical reactions that result in coal fires. So spraying down your coal, apart from making it harder to use in the boilers, will also potentially be the catalyst for more coal fires. This is why coal bunkers are actually very well insulated at the time. Now, obviously, if your insulation isn't too good, you potentially end up with something like USS Maine. So in the military, you're more likely to try and put that coal fire out sooner rather than later, and you probably have the manpower to do it as well. But as I said, with the prevention, it's partly making sure you have dry coal and also making sure you have good quality coal, because anthracite coal, Welsh coal, that kind of stuff, is far, far less likely to spontaneously combust than some cheap, horrible brown lignite. So a coal bunker fire in a Royal Navy warship circa World War I is going to be much, much rarer than a coal bunker fire in a German warship circa World War I. And that's not because the Germans were particularly bad at coal safety. It's simply the fact they had some really nasty, horrific coal they had to work with. Another thing you can do to prevent coal from igniting is to turn the coal over. Now, that's a horrible, thankless job, because it means a bunch of people, as you can see, like in this picture, with pretty much zero breathing apparatus to protect their lungs and so forth, would have to climb into a big enclosed steel container full of coal and start manually turning over with shovels. Not great, but it is a way of lessening the risks of a coal fire. But essentially, if you couldn't prevent a coal fire from breaking out for whatever reason, both on a military and a civilian ship, the general strategy was containment until you could shovel the smouldering coals into the boilers, and if you couldn't contain it, then you would smother it with water as a worst case scenario. John McDonough asks, I was reading about the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. I'm going over the history of the city, and the author discussed that a large number of permanent structures in the early city consisted of some of the hundreds of ships deserted by their crews for the gold fields. The ships were simply run aground very hard and then had storefronts attached. Some of the pictures are pretty cool. Is San Francisco unique in this regard, or has something similar happened elsewhere in the world? To be clear, I'm talking about the founding of a warehouse district or a high street in a city or town, not a hulk converted into a one-off barracks, prison, or naval facility. In terms of the sheer scale that it happened in San Francisco, I think that's pretty much unique. And I think that's a product of the fact that the gold rush occurred at a time when, well, you've got, one, a gold rush, so massive numbers of people showing up all at once. Two, it's occurring at a time when relatively substantial ships are available. Three, it's occurring at a time where there is a harbour capable of actually, running ships aground, or in the case of some streets in San Francisco, mooring them next to piers or boulevards that then became streets as the anchorage was filled in around the rotting hulks of the ships. And then finally, obviously, the economic incentive was enough that everybody just skedaddled out of the ship. That's pretty much a unique set of circumstances. You do have other gold rushes, like the Australian gold rush, but either the harbour facilities aren't really there to facilitate it, or the ships that are arriving are coming in from such a distance that the owners actually have better things to do with the ships than leave them there. And previous big emigre rushes that happened by ships for whatever reason, in previous times the ships would have been older, times would have been older, therefore the ships would have usually been smaller, less frequent, more valuable as a result per vessel, and therefore less likely to be used. Now, there are a number of places where individual buildings or a small collection of buildings have been made out of substantial intact portions of ships, but not whole streets and districts as far as I'm aware. There are quite a number of places where entire streets and districts have been made from ships, i.e. as ships have been dismantled, bits and pieces of their timbers have been used for such a purpose, but not in the way of San Francisco, where they're just like, here is a hull of a ship. Guess what? It's got a building on it now. Congratulations, you now have a weird building. Connor Johnson asks, during the bombardments as part of the Allied invasion of Normandy, Warspite had to have her guns replaced. When she did so, how likely was it for any of the guns she picked up to be ones which she had carried previously? Well, very approximately speaking, for the majority of her life, there were about half the 15-inch guns that the Royal Navy owned out at sea, aboard the Renown, Repulse, Hood, Queen Elizabeth, the R's and the 2 monitors as there were ashore. So half at sea, half ashore, which means that when you're looking at 184 guns plus a couple of prototype guns, you're looking at, roughly speaking, 23 sets of guns. So that's 23 sets of 8, which so it's not entirely accurate because, of course, Renown and Repulse only need 6, and the 2 monitors only need 2 each. But let's run with those approximate figures. So if Warspite comes in and changes out her guns, then she's initially, obviously, statistically cannot take on guns she has already had the first time round, because those guns have been on her and from the start. Now, those guns that she's just had go back into the ashore stock circulation, and then they may be dished out at any point, either singly, in pairs, or as a whole set, or whatever, to any other ship that comes back in. It's relatively unlikely that that is going to be Warspite. But in terms of absolute statistics, assuming that every Royal Navy ship trades in its guns at an approximately similar rate in peacetime, you would start off, therefore, with a roughly 1 in 23 chance from the second time she visits of receiving the same set of guns. Now, those odds are possibly slightly better for Warspite if you're talking about any individual gun, because, of course, mix and matching would take place. And the longer it was since a particular gun was landed, the better the chances of that gun coming back aboard Warspite. Not just because we're talking about, obviously, statistics, so the longer you repeat something, eventually, statistically speaking, it should happen, but also because the time of wear, return, repurpose, reissue would start to align more and more with Warspite's next schedule, because as we said, from the first time she checks in a gun, or from the first time she checks in any gun, 2, 3, 4 times in, that gun is very definitely not going to be issued back to her for her next mission, her next deployment. But by the time she gets back again, that gun has probably been issued out to another ship. But by the time she gets back in a third time after landing that gun, this other gun may probably be ashore being refurbished. And then, assuming by blind chance it's not picked up by another ship while it's just sitting in stock, the fourth time she comes back in, there's a reasonably decent chance of picking that particular gun. Now, unfortunately, because you're talking about 184 individual items, and you're talking about 15 individual ships, which may be taking random numbers of guns, one of which is Warspite, at various points during both peacetime and wartime, working out very neat, defined odds is a little bit beyond me. I mean, it could be done, but you'd need access to a huge amount of information about how regularly the Royal Navy battleships traded in their guns, and when they did, roughly, on average, how many guns they traded in. And then you'd have to have that for peacetime and for wartime. And then once you got to wartime, you'd also have to adjust for the ships on with 15-inch guns that were lost, like Barham and Hood, and so on and so forth. But I think the long and the short of it is that by the time Warspite has her guns replaced as a result of the Normandy invasion, there is a reasonably good chance that at least one of the guns was a gun that she had been issued previously, because by that point, towards the end of her career, she would have been issued with probably a decent percentage of the total Royal Navy stock of 15-inch guns at one point or another. So, when 2/3 of your stock have been issued to, let's say, we're just using arbitrary numbers for the here, it could be 1/3, it could be 2/3, or whatever. But when a substantial portion of your total gun stock has actually been on a particular ship at any given time, then suddenly the odds of receiving a brand new gun that you've used previously, especially when you have, well, at that point with X-Turret or non-operational 6 chances, Well, if you've got 6 chances at 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 or even 1 in 2 or 1 in, or 2/3 out of 1, then yeah, at that point, there's probably pretty good odds. The Judge 2017 asks, could USS Wyoming be refitted to be a fast anti-aircraft battleship? How hard would it be to take off the armour, refit her engines, and maybe put some wing turrets on either side of the superstructure? I mean, technically anything's possible with enough money, but I don't think taking off the armour would then make her a fast AA battleship. It would make her a very large anti-aircraft ship, but armour is kind of a fundamental issue when it comes to battleships. That said, if you have a look at this rather wonderful overhead shot of Wyoming in her days as an anti-aircraft training ship, you can see there's pluses and minuses when it comes to the feasibility of what you're talking about, assuming someone can be, shaken loose to actually pay for it all. So what you'll notice on her starboard side is, yes, there is a twin 5-inch 38 mounted on the wing, so it can, in fact, be done. As well as you've got 3 5-inch 38 twin mounts on former turrets 1, 2, and 6. Now, this unfortunately starts to run into the issue of the rather obvious problems. Firstly, although Wyoming has a lot more beam, she is in fact only 20 feet longer than an Atlanta-class cruiser. So, and you know what they had to do on the Atlantas to fit a lot of 5-inch 38s. So, just looking at this at the moment, in theory, that the layout that she's in at the moment, if you replaced the alternate anti-aircraft gun mountings that they've put on former turrets 3, 4, and 5, well, that would net you a total of 6 guns down the amidships, the centerline, which is approximately, that is exactly what the Atlantas have. Then you could obviously get rid of the boats. You could put another 5-inch twin mount opposite the one that's already there. You could probably put one abreast the forward superstructure instead of those other small anti-aircraft mounts they've got there. Traveling further back from the existing wing mounting, you can't really go and put stuff immediately further back abreast the turrets, because you might end up with blast effects. You could put another pair between where turret 4 was and where turret 5 is, but not really go any further back than that, at which point you've engineered a battleship that has a broadside of 5-inch 38 guns that exceeds the Atlantas by 4 barrels, because you've got 3 5-inch 38 twins down each side plus 6 on the center line, as opposed to the Atlantas, which have 6 on the center line and just the 1 wing mounting each. And before anyone asks about a tiered system, unfortunately, no. If you look at the slightly more famous photograph of Wyoming in this particular state, you'll notice, as you can pretty much see from here as well, that wing mount is actually up on a little bit of a pedestal, and the turret mounts 3 and 4, for rather obvious reasons, are quite low, flush to the deck, so you cannot put wing mounts in front of them. And then this leads us to another problem, which is that even if you completely redo Wyoming's machinery and maybe slap a bow extension on a la an Italian warship, she's still fundamentally a 21-knot hull. Getting her up to fast battleship standards, at least 27 knots, is going to be a big ask without sticking in extra power plants. And the minute you start sticking in extra power plants, then you have the problem of, well, that's going to start to, the new funnel you're going to need is going to start to intrude on turret 4, which deletes one of your centerline mounts, and everything starts to go on from there. So could you make a faster anti-aircraft battleship out of Wyoming with a bit more firepower than an Atlanta-class cruiser? Yes. It would be potentially, outside of the engine refit, not necessarily massively expensive, because you're just repurposing 3 barbettes in a way that they've clearly already done and removing some of the AA guns, including some 5-inch 38 singles, and putting in some more of this 5-inch 38 bandstanding for the twin mountings. But it's not really a huge accomplishment for the displacement of ship that you're doing. Now, with that said, if you were to pull the barbettes or completely or cut them down significantly and gut the ship, then yes, you have a little bit of extra hull length, and thanks to the additional beam and lack of superstructure, a lot more amidship centerline length. So you could, if you completely rebuilt Wyoming, do maybe a triple stack up front, Atlanta style, and maybe a triple stack aft, Atlanta style, which would only go as far back as the mainmast, or as far forward as the mainmast, I guess. And then if you said, okay, well, we're going to take out, we're taking out all the barbettes, but when we take out barbettes 4 and 5, if we say sacrifice the deck space where the boat deck is and where barbette 3 is, sorry, 3 and 4 that should be, to accommodate additional machinery and another funnel, then if you built some kind of centerline ridge, you could potentially fit 2, maybe 3 more 5-inch 38s on the center line. So at this point, if we're being really generous, you've got 9 twin 5-inch 38s on the center line. And if they're up on a ridge, and if you abandon the pedestal mounting that they've done for the wing mounting in this particular case, then you could probably get, I would say, at least 3, 4, 5, or maybe 5-inch 38 twins going down either side, if you're prepared to accept them being at least partially abreast of some of the stacked ones fore and aft as well. You'd essentially be creating a gigantic firecracker with that many guns loaded up, all with 5-inch 38 ammo. But it could in theory be done, but at that point you will have spent so much money completely gutting and redoing it, then essentially, is it really USS Wyoming anymore? Essentially, all you'd be keeping at that point is the name and the outer hull plating, because everything else would have been pretty much brand new. At which point, you might as well build yourself a purpose-built, fast anti-aircraft capital ship of this kind of displacement. Red Ranger asks, 3-part question. If on the morning that the Grand Fleet was to depart for the Battle of Jutland, all of the Kongo-class battle cruisers, along with a small escort of destroyers, showed up requesting permission to join the formation, which was granted, but they're asked to stay in the rear as a reserve. 1. Who would have been the likely - probable candidates that the Japanese Navy would have chosen to lead said squadron? 2. In such a scenario where 2 or more Allied navies are operating together under a single unit, how is tactical and strategic command agreed and acted upon? And 3. How would the Japanese squadron have fared in said battle? In terms of who would command said fleet, this is a little difficult to pin down, because on the one hand, deploying the 4 latest Japanese capital ships to a very real potential of combat would necessitate, in theory, the most prestigious of all command positions. On the other hand, the particular role of the Congos within the Japanese fleet would possibly suggest another candidate. So in the first case of it being the most prestigious command and therefore attracting the most prestigious admiral, that would probably be Vice Admiral Yoshimatsu Shigetaro, who was the commander of First Fleet, which is obviously the battleships and so forth, between the end of 1915 and the beginning of 1917. So he would be in command of First Fleet at the time, and as essentially the leading at-sea Japanese admiral, he would be the one in charge. I mean, Admiral Togo is still technically a marshal admiral. They might drag him out for retirement just for the prestige value, but he probably wouldn't be in any kind of operational active command. However, that's not where it ends, because that's the First Fleet. The Second Fleet is the kind of mobile strike force, fast response type unit. And that, therefore, is more likely where that role fits sending the Congos halfway across the planet to fight alongside your allies. And the admiral who was in charge of the Second Fleet was Yashiro Rokuro. Or Rokuro, maybe? I don't know. So those would be the 2 most likely candidates for command. Then, okay, so when they're operating together in a single unit, how's tactical and strategic command acted and agreed on? Generally speaking, if an Allied unit shows up at the last minute, which this scenario they are, then they essentially would be tacked on to the lower end of command and control. So if they're going to fight as a single unit, and they would take orders from whoever the primary contingent, i.e. British, admiral in charge was. Now, that could lead to some rather interesting issues because you specified it's the Grand Fleet, not the battle cruiser fleet. So in this case, they're going to be paired up with 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron. And the reason why that's interesting is twofold. Firstly, the Congos are considerably faster than the Invincibles in 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, but also, from a strictly rank perspective, Admiral Hood, in charge of 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, is a rear admiral. Both of the Japanese admirals, whichever one ends up going, are vice admirals, which is the next rank up. But, weirder things have happened. Unless Jellicoe steps in specifically, the fact is Hood is going to know what Jellicoe's orders, what the codes are, etc., etc. It makes more sense for Hood to be leading the formation. And the Japanese will probably go along with that. They understand how these things work. Now, how would the Japanese squadron have fared in said battle? Well, if they are attached to 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, if Hood has any sense, which, he was a pretty decent officer, he'll probably stick the Congos ahead with Invincible leading 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron immediately astern, because that A puts Hood, not quite in the middle, a little bit further back, but roughly speaking in the middle of the formation. And it means that if an opportunity presents itself where extreme speed is needed, well, the Congos are faster so that they can go motoring off without having to worry about getting in the way of the Invincibles. Now, where this all shakes out rather interestingly, at least for the British, and rather potentially badly for the Germans, is the fact that, of course, the first thing that 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron does of any particular note at the Battle of Jutland is to rock up and start firing at 1st Scouting Group, with the end result of Invincible obviously exploding, but Lutzow taking eventually fatal damage in return from Invincible, plus a bunch of other ships get hit as well, but that's the primary outcome. Now, in this case, 1st Scouting Group is outnumbered. They are very definitely outgunned. The Congos, whilst I have pointed out repeatedly in the Second World War they really do not have the world's best armour, they are still better protected than the Invincibles. Again, admittedly not the world's greatest achievement, but it's there. 8-inch belt armour might just about reject 11-inch shell fire. I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath too much about the 12-inch, but more importantly, the fact is that there's now 7 battle cruisers in Hood's overall command, and the Congos are firing 14-inch guns. Yet this is not, even assuming that the Congos only have okay gunnery, this is not going to end well for 1st Scouting Group at all. Lutzow's very definitely going to take fatal damage. Potentially one or more of the other German battle cruisers could take fatal damage, or at least be slowed down enough that the Grand Fleet can pummel them as Admiral Scheer disappears into the murk. Now, where this might then have interesting secondary effects that don't necessarily rely on the Congo's guns themselves is that when you have the second encounter between the High Seas Fleet and the Grand Fleet, if you have 2 or 3 more German battle cruisers either sunk, sinking, or crippled, then what's left of 1st Scouting Group is not really in a position to provide an XP pinata and distraction for the Grand Fleet, which makes it more likely that the Grand Fleet will be able to open up for considerably longer on Scheer's main force, and that in turn, technically speaking, nothing about that prevents Scheer from turning away, but it might mean A, Scheer's turnaway is a little bit more noticed, and maybe something actually follows him enough to establish where he is, and thus Jellicoe potentially maybe knows where the High Seas Fleet ends up going, which could change everything with them in the following morning engagement, or just more prosaically, more of Scheer's ships get hit, and potentially 1 or 2 more of them or more get slowed down, crippled, and then chewed up while the rest escape. So overall, the arrival of the Congos, they may be badly damaged. it's relatively unlikely one of them would replace Invincible in the exploding department for no other reason than that engagement is fairly short and sharp, and there's going to be a lot more fire coming in on towards the Germans. But potentially the knock-on effects could lead to maybe 4, 5, 6 more German ships ending up being sunk. As I said, not even necessarily strictly by the Congos. In fact, definitely not strictly by the Congos, but by either damage inflicted by or enabled by the Congos, which causes them to slow down or be more obvious and then get picked apart and chewed up by the rest of the British ships. Library of Context asks, did the US Navy aerial torpedoes use the same triggering mechanism as the Mark 14? And if not, could this mechanism have been retrofitted into the Mark 14? And did US PT boats switch to aerial torpedoes, and was this because of the triggering issues of the Mark 14 or the simpler deployment method, i.e. rolling it off the side? US PT boats used the Mark 8, not the Mark 14, because the Mark 14 was the submarine torpedo. The Mark 15 was the latest and greatest surface launch torpedo for destroyers and such like, but the PT boats used the slightly lighter Mark 8. The problem was the Mark 8, being a much older torpedo, didn't really have all that much bang to it. And so given that PT boats obviously need to carry relatively lightweight weapons, considering they are relatively small vessels, they went with the Mark 13 because, well, the Mark 13 was designed to be just chucked off of something into the water and get moving. It was relatively small, compact and lightweight and carried a bigger warhead than the Mark 8 did. That's a Mark 13 at the bottom, by the way, in comparison to a Mark 14 up top, so you can see why it was a little bit lighter. Now, the Mark 13 used the Mark 4 exploder as opposed to the Mark 6, which was one of the major Achilles heels of the Mark 14 torpedo. It doesn't have a magnetic influence detonator, at least at the beginning of the war, and so it wouldn't have suffered from that problem. Also, the Mark 13 is a considerably slower torpedo than a Mark 14, so the extremely violent impact leading to the rapid disassembly of the detonator before it could actually detonate, and all the stresses on the firing pins and everything, in theory, should not have occurred on the Mark 13. Although the Mark 13 did have its own little laundry list of issues. The problem is, if you took the Mark 4 exploder and, bodge jobbed it into a Mark 14, whilst you wouldn't have the magnetic influence detonator problems, it's an exploder that's designed to work on a torpedo that's running, 12, 13 knots slower, so there is every chance it would still suffer from the, oh no, it's been slammed into the side of a target far faster than it's actually capable of withstanding and disintegrating before being of any practical use problem, which the Mark 6 had, and the Mark 6 was supposed to be on paper designed for a torpedo of the mass and speed of the Mark 14. So you would have obviated one problem but not the other, and given that they managed to obviate the magnetic problem by just switching off the magnetic feature, and they still had problems with the rest of it, putting Mark 4 exploders into the Mark 14s probably isn't really going to solve all that much. Andre DeCoult asks, much has been discussed in various Drydock episodes in relation to the Age of Sail depictions of Hornblower and the Aubrey Martin series, or Maturin series, sorry. Are you familiar with the historic fiction novel series Bolitho by author Alexander Kent, pseudonym of the author Douglas Riemann? Somehow this seems to be a much less popular well-known series than the other two. Anyway, if yes, how would you rate it as historically accurate plausible in naval things as related to Bolitho novels? And how would you briefly compare the depictions of things in those compared with the other two mentioned, and why do you think it's less known? Unfortunately, I'm not particularly familiar with the Bolitho series, although looking through the covers of some of the books in various online shops, I have a sneaking suspicion that I may have read one or two of them in my youth. Now, obviously, not being familiar with them, I can't really give you a fair comparison from my own perspective between Hornblower, Aubrey, Maturin and Bolitho, but from what I've read of various reviews, what would I say? The best way to describe it would be that the Aubrey Maturin series is probably the standard, the gold standard to hold everyone to for that kind of writing, at least as far as long form series are concerned in the Age of Sail. Whereas although the Bolitho series is relatively accurate when it wants to be, it's a little bit more flash and action. So perhaps the best way, maybe the best analogy, again, this is based on impression from reviews of other people who have read both series. The best thing would be to maybe describe it as the Bolitho series is kind of the literary version of a comic book, whereas the Aubrey Maturin series is the literary version of a graphic novel, if that makes any sense at all, with Hornblower kind of veering between the two depending on which particular book you're reading. Roadrunner Meep Meep asks, I was watching your video on how naval guns are made, and I was wondering, if money was not a factor, what are the theoretical size limits to bronze guns? Could they have been usable in the World Wars, or would their utility have ended by the start of the breech-loading era? Well, it depends on the type of gun you're building, because the absolutely colossally sillily sized Tsar cannon in the Kremlin and the gigantic Ottoman bombards that were used in the Dardanelles, one of which is now at Fort Nelson in the UK, were both bronze guns, albeit they are massive stone-firing cannon, not iron shot-firing guns. And that's kind of where you have a bit of a problem, because bronze overall is a somewhat softer metal than iron or steel, and also obviously subject to work hardening, which means that when it comes to the latter part of the 19th century, you do get bronze signalling guns and so forth, but that little bit more malleability and flexibility in bronze is going to make making bronze breech loaders a bit more difficult. Now, yes, bronze signal guns are breech loading, but the kind of interrupted screw breech that you see on a steel gun would, I suspect, be somewhat more difficult to maintain in bronze on a consistent basis if the entire gun is bronze. And obviously, when you start getting longer barreled guns and, therefore greater working pressures and so forth, I think you're going to have more and more problems, because even in the late 1870s, when you've got a mixture of rifled and smoothbore and breech loading and muzzle loading, it's already being noted that what bronze guns are available at that point are being used with wooden sabots to save the gun barrel from excessive wear. And that's before the introduction of more modern propellants at the end of the 19th century. So I think the sheer size of the Ottoman and Russian bombards shows that you could, in theory, make a bronze gun big enough to be usable in World War I or World War II. But I suspect it would have either worn or jammed itself much, much faster than a steel gun, unless you absolutely massively overbuilt it, at which point it would be both colossally expensive and colossally heavy compared to its steel equivalent. Greb asks, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, it did it to cripple the US Navy before beginning a war. My question is there a port or harbour that the Royal Navy used between 1900 and 1945 that would be an equivalent to that scale, and who could carry out such an attack, and how do you think that could happen? Well, the thing is, historically, it's much more difficult to Pearl Harbor the Royal Navy because the Royal Navy tends to be a lot more distributed thanks to its global commitments. However, there are a couple of places where enough of the Royal Navy's strength is gathered in one place that a surprise attack on that place that was relatively successful could potentially cripple a capital ship force of equivalent impact to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, prior to World War I, pretty much the only place you're going to be able to pull that off is Malta, because the home fleet or Atlantic fleet or Channel fleet or whatever the Royal Navy's calling it at this particular time of year is fairly distributed. So you could attack Portsmouth, Plymouth, Chatham, the Nore, any number of places and catch a portion of one part of the Royal Navy, but that's not a Pearl Harbor attack. But the Mediterranean fleet, which was kind of the crown jewel in the Royal Navy for a good portion of the post-Napoleonic to pre-World War I period, was usually the single largest commitment of Royal Navy warships anywhere on the planet, and B, they did tend to congregate every so often at Malta in fairly large numbers proportional to their overall fleet size. So, yeah, Malta would probably be the point pre-World War I when you'd potentially pull it off the most. The problem is who would do that? Well, and how? You'd have to be doing it 1900 through 1914. You'd have to be doing it by either torpedo boats or submarines, destroyers, that kind of thing. And the only people with any substantial amount of naval power in the Mediterranean at that point are France and Italy. And honestly, compared to the harbour defences of Malta and the size of the fleet that's based there, neither of them really has the wherewithal to do that with either the Italian fleet, so pre-1914, or the Toulon based units, i.e. the French Mediterranean-based units of the pre-World War I period, disregarding the fact, of course, for a portion of that, the French are allies of the British. There's just not enough of them, and them appearing on the horizon, bearing in mind being torpedo boats they'd have, or destroyers, it would take a while for them to close in, and submarine technology really isn't up to it, I don't think, in that time period. I mean, yes, during the First World War, the submarines did sneak in and cause a lot of damage in places they really weren't expected in various parts of the world. But when you look at the submarines involved, they're usually subs that have only just been launched, in the last year or two, the latest and greatest. Subs, for the majority of 1900 and 1914, are essentially harbour defence vessels or coast defence vessels at best. But of course, that all changes when the Fire Nation, Germany, attacks, because from 1914 onwards to 1945, you have Scapa Flow, and this is the Royal Navy at Scapa Flow in the interwar period. Yeah, they're fairly densely packed. I mean, the capital ships aren't quite as densely packed as Battleship Row, but it's not a million miles off, and that's a substantial portion of the Royal Navy's capital strength. So very definitely you could Pearl Harbor them, as long as they maintain this kind of anchoring formation. Of course, in wartime they tend to be a little bit more dispersed. As for who could do that, well, in the 1914 through 45 period, the main suspect would be Germany. Obviously, U-47 did get into Scapa in World War II. The Germans do have torpedo bombers in World War II, albeit with somewhat questionable torpedoes. But in theory, if you wanted to give Luftwaffe 5 enough torpedo bomber variants of Heinkel 111s and Junkers 88s, they could give it a shot, although by the time they'd got enough of them, again, the Royal Navy had pretty much dispersed across the planet to fight everyone and their dog. Of course, the problem prior to World War II is that, well, no one else in Europe has an aircraft carrier apart from Bern, and let's face it, Bern isn't going to launch Pearl Harbor English T edition any time soon. And the Germans don't have Norway, so they can't fly Luftwaffe 5 over. At which point, you'd basically be looking at maybe a theoretical American carrier strike. If the Americans, pushed all their carriers into the Atlantic and doodled over, they're pretty much the only ones with the range and striking capacity to pull it off. So, if for some bizarre and weird reason in the mid to late 1930s, the Americans decided they're going to have a go at the Royal Navy, they could wait for a situation like this to develop in Scapa and then send their carriers over to launch a mass torpedo strike for whatever particular nefarious purpose they've chosen. But that'll be about it, I think. BFW asks, how did the French plan to get away with cheating on the Washington Naval Treaty with the Richelieus being over 35,000 tons? Well, they didn't initially intend to. As designed, the Richelieu class would have displaced 35,000 tons or near enough to, in much the same way that the King George V's and the North Carolinas displaced 35,000 tons or near enough to. So they were intending to stick with the treaty. However, when Richelieu and Jean Bart were laid down, this was also around about the time the Second London Naval Treaty was collapsing, with Japan walking out, etc. And so as they were constructed over the latter part of the 1930s, and it was pretty clear that the naval treaty system was dead, they were able to make some modifications based on design requirements that came through, and as long as the ship as a whole could handle it, they weren't really under any further obligation at that point to start making savings to get the ship back under 35,000 tons. So, for example, initially, one of the weight-saving measures to keep the ships under 35,000 tons was to have 5 triple dual-purpose 152mm or 6-inch secondary turrets, whereas there had been a proposal for a mixed battery of 152mm anti-surface and 75mm anti-aircraft guns. And with its 5 triple 152s, Richelieu would have been under the weight limit. However, it was discovered during the construction process that actually the triple 152 was technically dual purpose, but much like many immediately pre-war supposedly dual purpose 6-inch guns, it was more of an on-paper idea than an actual practical reality. And so they eliminated 2 of the turrets and stuck in half a dozen twin mounts for lighter weight anti-aircraft guns, but still heavy anti-aircraft guns. Now, of course, that added weight to the design, and the fact was the barbette and the mounting, etc., for the triple 152s were still there. The only thing that was missing was the turret on top. So adding in all those extra guns, their ammunition, etc., added considerably more weight than was saved by just eliminating 6 guns and their turrets, because I said all the other stuff below deck was still mostly there. And then as they were adding other light anti-aircraft weapons and so forth, again, why bother making weight savings as long as the hull is still balanced in trim and can handle the upgrades? And so when they finally emerge, or Richelieu at least finally emerges into active service, she is now a fraction over 37,000 tons, with these and other minor changes all adding up. If you compare it to the true displacement at time of commission of King George V in North Carolina, they're not massively over, but obviously a bit more than the other two. But most of that, as I said, is just the fact they realise, well, we don't have to stick to these restrictions anymore, and so we won't. Sapper Ninja asks, what happens if the Royal Navy and the US Navy adopt a more Italian, French, Japanese type interpretation of the treaty limits and proceed to lie horrendously about displacement? Well, if we assume that this goes roughly as far back as when the other nations started to take rather creative approaches to what exactly was treaty compliant, then you could perhaps expect the later counties, probably not the early ones, maybe the early ones if Britain really goes in early, but at least the mid and late counties to be built with 4.5-inch continuous belts from the start, and probably the refits to the first batch, the Kents, probably happening a lot sooner. You are probably not going to see the Arethusas, because they can just lie about the Leander's capabilities and fit them in onto the fit, as many cruisers they want onto the tonnage in that way instead. The Town class, I wouldn't necessarily say they'll go straight for Belfast-Edinburgh style modifications from the start, but I think probably after maybe the first batch of the Southamptons, you'll start to see more and more modifications somewhere along the lines of what you would eventually see with Belfast and Edinburgh. For destroyers, changes will probably be relatively minimal. They might make the triples just big enough to stick a second set of torpedo launchers on them. The immediate before and afters for the tribals, the 6-gun, 6 4.7-inch guns are pretty good. And honestly, taking creative liberties with displacement doesn't really change the whole dual purpose, or lack thereof, issues with Royal Navy destroyers of the pre-war period. On a aircraft carrier scale, I suspect you will probably see slightly taller hangar heights on the Illustriouses, and the Illustriouses as a whole probably being somewhat larger, kind of maybe pushing towards the Implacables, because I think at that point they'll instead of going, okay, well, what's the best carrier we can get within X displacement, they'll probably look at Ark Royal and go, okay, let's have that kind of capability, except with an armoured flight deck. And if they have to slightly reduce it to make it vaguely believable, they probably will. But a kind of an armoured Ark Royal is more likely what you'd see with the carriers. And with the battleships, well, you can't entirely cheat the treaties and have a completely different main armament. So with the King George V's, probably the single biggest change will just be now there's 3 quad turrets, like in this image, which I photoshopped together myself. And outside of that, moving across the pond, the North Carolinas, well, they are built to face off against their own armament, so I don't think the North Carolinas themselves will probably have much additional armor, because they were changed up to 16-inch at the last minute, and adding 16-inch proof armor to the North Carolinas is more going to be an issue with the ships themselves than it is with playing fast and loose with the treaty limits. But the South Dakotas almost certainly won't be what they were historically were. Instead, you can probably just expect to see a slightly enlarged and up-armored version of the North Carolinas, because if you don't have to stick to 35,000 tons, then why would you just make a slightly more heavily protected North Carolina type, and you've got the space, you're not having to cramp everything all up again. Some of the issues with the Clevelands will probably be alleviated. They were a little bit top-heavy and unstable by the end because there wasn't a lot of reserve stability. But if you can just make them that little bit larger, that little, have a little bit more reserve for upgrades in them by, maybe making them 11,500 tonners instead of 10,000 or just under tonners. Wichita might actually get some sister ships because, again, they'll be able to just make those little design allowances so that she's not as unstable and as heavily loaded as she is. Wasp will probably be just another Yorktown, or a Yorktown with a few aesthetic changes to make it look slightly different. The Sims class might actually have a hull large enough to stably support the original planned armament, and when you look at some of the planned armament for the Fletcher class before they downscaled it to what it historically did, well, they could now have that 6th gun and the few other little bits and pieces they were looking at throwing at it, because they can just make the hull again a little bit bigger and lie about the displacement. Jack von Kuhn asks, what exactly made the Hipper class so inefficient? What design choices made this class so overweight for her capabilities? There's a whole combination of smaller factors. For one thing, she goes for the turtle back armor layout that is similar in general concept to Bismarck, but which is very inefficient with its use of weight, so that adds something. She's got a relatively heavy secondary battery for a heavy cruiser, at least in terms of sheer numbers of guns, even if they're not 5 or 6 inch guns, there's still quite a few of them. That adds a little bit more to the weight. She has very large turrets, and the turrets have armor faces, and so that means with a big barbette diameter plus a heavy turret plus a lot of surface area for turret and barbette, then even having okay-ish protection for those areas is going to add substantially more to the ship's weight than others. I mean, the County class were notoriously large turreted for a typical heavy cruiser with a twin 8-inch turret, in part because of all the additional mechanisms that went into trying to make them anti-aircraft capable with ridiculously high elevation, and even those have an interior barbette diameter that is smaller than the Admiral Hippers. And then you look at something like the Japanese, and it's much, much smaller. In fact, Hipper's internal barbette diameter for a twin 8-inch is almost exactly the same internal diameter as the triple 8-inch turret on a New Orleans class. And then you have the German love of being certainly for World War II, the nation that absolutely champions the Department of Redundancy department. And much like Bismarck, Hipper has and the Hipper class in general, have an awful lot of redundant and backup systems built into them, which are technically, theoretically good for damage control, but the German designs of this period tend to, at least in my opinion, carry that through to absolutely absurd degrees. When you look at both the Hippers and the Bismarcks, sometimes people say, well, look at their pumping capacity, for instance. Look at how much water they could pump out with the pumps and the backup pumps and the backups to the backup pumps, the intralinking of all the pumps and everything. Like all this water they can easily pump out to help them with damage control, which is fine to an extent in that, yes, those overall figures are relatively impressive, except for two things. One, a lot of those pumps are confined to specific areas of the ship. They can't all interlink and help each other out across the whole length of the ship. So if you've got loads of flooding aft, 3/4 of your pumping capacity is fairly useless, using arbitrary figures as an example. And I think it also kind of misses the point in that if you have a pumping capacity that is, let's say, able to pump out per minute 50% of your overall displacement in water, again, using just random arbitrary figures, but you'll see if you look into it in more detail just how absurd some of these pumping figures were. Yes, in theory, you can pump out a lot of water. The problem is, if you are in a position where someone has done so much damage to you that you are having tens of thousands of tons of water per minute flood into your ship, the chances are having a few additional pumps are not going to save you, because whoever's been able to do that to you is probably going to be able to do a bit more damage to you and finish you off. So between all these, extra weighty redundant systems, plus the slightly comically large turrets for twin 8-inch, plus the inefficient armor setup, etc., you end up with a ship that is carrying an awful lot of weight for what are relatively pedestrian capabilities as far as a interwar heavy cruiser goes. And in order to fit all those in, you need the hull to be relatively large. And then if you've got a big heavy hull, you need a lot of power to push it through the water. And therefore the machinery weighs a lot, and therefore now you need even more power, and you end up in a bit of a circular chase up and up the tonnages as everything you put in makes the ship bigger, which needs more power, and then machinery is heavier and everything else is now heavier, which now means you need even more power, which means you need a bigger hull, and so on and so forth. And so you end up, as I say, in this kind of spiral chase upwards, where you end up with the final Hipper class, or the ones which are never actually built fully, at least, ending up more within shouting distance of a Des Moines class's displacement than anything else. Michael Imbezi asks, do you ever intend to visit the Washington Navy Yard - National Museum of the US Navy and or feature some of the more unique artifacts they have there? Yes, that is definitely on my wish list of places to visit. However, unlike most museums and museum ships, it is not readily accessible for someone like myself, i.e. a British civilian. I would have to be escorted because it is on an active base, as far as I'm aware. And so there's just that little bit of extra logistics and planning involved in, well, one, obviously, as with every other museum I visit, letting them know ahead of time that I'd like to come and I'd like to film, and getting all those permissions worked out, but then also sorting out somebody to go with me so that, I don't get shot and everybody is happy that I'm not about to run off with the whatever latest Navy secrets they're storing in Washington Navy Yard, or something to that effect. And, of course, that also relies on communication internally working, because when I get to covering my visit to NAS Pensacola and the museum there, boy, there's a bit of a yo-yo and a ping-pong story as to whether or not the security guards on the gate were actually paying attention when they were told about what is and is not an acceptable form of ID, and who can and cannot escort people onto base, and what they should or shouldn't do about it. And yeah, an awful lot of driving around the perimeter of a very, very large base, being sent from pillar to post before they finally decided, actually, yes, I can go and see the museum. Farenderetta asks, what tensions existed between Britain and the US that warranted the naval treaties to ease that relationship? Fundamentally, it came down to who was going to be top dog in the world, because much as nowadays it's easy to look back and go, oh yes, World War One, the start of the Great Anglo-American Alliance - special relationship - whatever else you want to call it. That wasn't actually really the case at the time, for various reasons. One of which was that there had been quite a lot of pressure from certain political groups and voting blocs within the US to either join World War One on the side of Germany or to just stay out of the whole thing. So the US joining in on the side of the Allies in World War One was by no means a certainty until almost the very last moment. And, well, Britain hadn't really forgotten that. So although the US had fought alongside them at the end of World War One, between the previous issues and the fact that in the aftermath of World War One, you had Wilson trying, and to a certain extent succeeding, in watering down the punitive measures that Britain and France wanted to impose on Germany, in part by promising, there's a whole very complicated political discussion there, but in part promising that this whole new League of Nations thing was going to resolve everything. And then, of course, the US government back at home turning around and refusing to have anything to do with the League of Nations or most of Wilson's ideas, thus leaving everybody in a little bit of limbo. Let's just say the kind of international trust between the British Empire and the United States of America in the early 1920s was nowhere near as great as some people would like to think, and certainly nowhere near as close as it would be in the run-up to and during World War II. Things did change quite a bit during that time period. On top of that, you had the fact that there were still some unresolved issues about, again, related to who is top dog, what exactly constituted hostile rights and belligerent rights in war. Certainly at the beginning of World War One, the first couple of years, there had been quite a bit of kerfuffle in the US over the British basically turning around and saying, look, this is our interpretation of belligerent rights. This is what we've done for hundreds of years in terms of, blockading, not allowing neutral trade in with contraband or war materials or anything that could be interpreted as war materials into hostile ports and so on and so forth. And the US going, oh yeah, but we're a neutral power, we want to trade with whoever we want. And then obviously elements of the Royal Navy going, yeah, that's not how this is going to work, mate. Plus, if you read some of the newspapers at the time, thanks to the propaganda that had been going on for about a century at that point, there were a bunch of both general Americans, politicians and merchant ship owners who were absolutely certain these issues had been resolved by the War of 1812, only to discover very, very rudely that actually Britain had concluded the War of 1812 by going, yeah, we're not changing any of those things you were protesting about, because trade between neutral and belligerent powers had been one of the larger causes of the War of 1812. About the only thing that wasn't on the cards in World War One was impressment. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room was that for the past century and a bit, Britain and the British Empire had been the big power on the world stage. And then the US had decided it wanted to get involved in being the big power on the world stage rather than just one of the major powers. And more particularly, of course, with the Acts in 1916 and forward, the US had tried to establish this by building an absolutely gigantic navy from, not nothing, but from a relatively speaking smaller navy for a great power when you compared it to something like Germany or Britain's. They were now determined to have the biggest navy, but unlike somebody going, we're going to have the biggest army, because to a certain extent, any power that said we're going to have the biggest and best army in the world, Britain at the time was happy to go, yeah, sure, you have that. That's fine. You have the biggest army over there, and all of our stuff is over here, and there's ocean between you and your army and our stuff. So if you want to come and take our stuff, you have to come by sea, and we've got the biggest navy, so it all works out. And this is why, historically, Britain had actually been more pro-German until the Germans started building a massive navy, because then Britain went, yeah, big navy. That is an existential threat to Britain and the British Empire. That we cannot abide. Therefore, we now need to look for allies to counterbalance this annoying power that's building a massive navy. And then you got the switch from, historically being more pro-German to suddenly allying with France and Russia, two powers that Britain had spent the last 100 years or so being paranoid about going to war with. And now in the 1920s, it looked like the USA was going to try and go, yes, well, now we are going to have the largest navy in the world. And the Royal Navy was going to go, actually, mate, we are going to have the largest navy in the world. And neither side looked like they were going to budge. And thus a massive arms race was going to loom. And almost all arms races had almost inevitably led to war unless a bigger power still had stepped in and told them to knock it off. And there were no bigger powers than Britain and the US at the time in terms of industrial and financial capacity, so everyone was looking at going, yeah, there's going to be a war, isn't there? Basically a war for who was going to control the planet, or a good portion of it. Now, there were mitigating factors against this. There was still a fairly large isolationist movement in the US, and in the early 1920s, the government of the US changed, so there was a lot more political view towards isolationism, but of course, just because the US government has changed once, they have elections every 4 years, it could change again, and they could be back onto the, we're going to build up a massive navy and take over control of the seas. And all of this added up to a surprising amount of tension. Neither side necessarily wanted war in the abstract, but both sides could see a war coming about because of conflicting interests that were irreconcilable, unless something else was done, like, say, a naval treaty, which was essentially everyone sitting down and going, okay, well, you can share. Emily asks, since I was moving last month and couldn't make the last Patreon Drydock, I've popped 2 questions into this month, which is fine. Firstly, what are some good sources to learn about Marines and naval infantry? Particularly, I'd like to learn how they evolved from just placing regular soldiers on a ship to a more specialised role. And 2, could torpedoes be used against wooden ships? Certainly those with magnetic detonators may not be of too much use, but could ones with proximity or contact detonators trigger against a wooden hull? Well, to answer the second question first, yes, torpedoes could be effective against wooden ships with contact detonators, because although wood is softer than metal, and you might therefore think maybe the force of the impact wouldn't be quite as strong, you've got to remember that in part because wood is less strong than metal, wooden hulls have to be thicker, so there is still a fair amount of mass behind the side of a wooden ship which would provide enough resistance to cause a contact detonating torpedo to detonate, plus of course the ship's ribs and so forth. And in the era of torpedoes, quite a lot of wooden ships still had a fair amount of iron or steel internal, at least, reinforcements, which would provide a bit more strength and therefore a bit more resistance. And depending on the ship in question, they may also have something like a copper sheath, which would provide still more resistance to a torpedo. So certainly a torpedo could, upon contact, detonate with a wooden ship. The main issue you tend to find is that most wooden ships would be smaller than the average iron or steel vessels, and so a submarine commander very often would probably prefer to use his deck gun to sink a wooden vessel, which also obviously is a lot more flammable, as compared to expending a torpedo on what would probably be relatively small prey. Now, as far as Marines and naval infantry goes, particularly how they evolve into shipboard troops, that's a little bit more difficult. As far as I'm aware, no one's done a really big, chunky history of Marine infantry as a whole. At least as far as I'm aware. If anyone does know such, please let me know. But that means that realistically, if you want to learn about that transition, you're probably going to need to look at the specific histories of the older Marine Corps in the world, because obviously the more recent ones will have been able to pick up the lessons from those older ones and just launch straight in, at which point you'd want to be looking at histories of the Dutch Marines. Unfortunately, the best histories of the Dutch Marines are in Dutch, so hopefully find a good translator, I would say, unless there are any Dutch-speaking subscribers who are listening to this who know of particularly good histories of the Dutch Marines that can actually also be found in English, in which point obviously let us know in the comments below. If you're looking for Royal Marine history, because they are also one of the oldest marine units, then you can look for the Royal Marines 1664 to the present by Richard Brooks, or Julian Thompson's Royal Marines from Sea Soldiers to a Special Force, both of which, as the both names suggest, cover pretty much from their founding through to the present day. So you'll get a very good picture of how they went from just random troops aboard ships to specifically Marine infantry. And the absolute oldest Marine unit is actually the Spanish Marines, Terraco Nuevo de la Mar de Nápoles. However, again, much like with the Dutch, I rather suspect that you're probably only going to find decent-ish sources about the Spanish Marines in Spanish. Again, unless anyone in mainland Spain happens to know of both a good Spanish source for the Spanish Marines, but that is also simultaneously available in English, which would be obviously quite handy for someone who's presumably asking the question in English, and I'm going to assume probably doesn't speak Dutch or Spanish. Ernest Evans Went Leroy Jenkins asks, to the best of your knowledge, when was the first time a Chinese warship circumnavigated the Earth, and barring that, what was the furthest distance a Chinese warship got from the Chinese coast? In the time period the channel covers, I don't think any Chinese warships ever went all the way around the world. Certainly, these days, some of the more modern stuff has, but if you're going up to about 1950, I don't think any Chinese warships actually did. At which point, I would have to say that the furthest any Chinese warship ever got from the Chinese coast during the time period the channel covers would be either, if you believe the theory is that some of the Chinese treasure ships might have stumbled across the western coast of either North and South or South America, or the slightly more concrete Chinese treasure fleet expeditions that covered the Indian Ocean and got to the western part of it. Or if you want to be really, really nitpicky, some of the Chinese warships in the latter part of the 19th century that were built in Europe and then sailed over to China would technically be Chinese warships when they left harbour in the North Sea or the Atlantic and headed round, and that would technically make them the furthest, although obviously they didn't start out in China, so take that one as you will. Two Squirrels in a Trench Coat asks, if Vickers hadn't upsold the 14-inch gun to the Imperial Japanese Navy, would the 12-inch armed Kongos still have been viewed as useful? Would they have received the same refits as the historic 14-inch armed Kongos, or would the Japanese have prioritised replacing them over other units? And how do you think their roles would have changed during the war if they'd been armed with 12-inch guns? Well, you could debate as to which version would have been built. Would they have built the 8-gun version or the 10-gun version? The 10-gun option for the 12-inch design is seen in World of Warships as the Ishizuchi, I think it's how it's pronounced. But broadly speaking, obviously being changed almost at the last minute, the 12-inch design, whether it has 8 or 10 guns, has the same speed and protection as Kongo would historically have. So in that respect, it's pretty much identical. However, the big problem that the Japanese would be facing in the interwar period going towards World War II is that the Kongos, by having 14-inch guns, theoretically still had a reasonable chance, at least firepower-wise, against a decent number of other capital ships. They weren't particularly well protected, but they were fast. And at the end of the day, as long as they could get their hits in first, 14-inch guns still would do a reasonable number to, a good swathe of the US standards, and had a fair amount of firepower against, Royal Navy battle cruisers, Renown and Repulse, which didn't have tremendous amounts of armour either. But even against Queen Elizabeth or R-class, obviously it's a inch smaller than the guns that they're designed to deal with, but close enough to still do some pretty nasty damage. And this is why they were retained and upgraded, amongst other reasons. 12-inch guns, particularly World War I era 12-inch guns, yeah, that's pretty much a second-line vessel. There's not a huge amount you can really do with that. at least in the anti-capital ship role. Now, this kind of ship could be taken in hand and refitted to be a kind of super cruiser killer, reverting back to the original battle cruiser role. That would be pretty easy to do, depending also on how much money they wanted to spend on it. If they wanted to just accept its existing armor and gun layout and just replace all its machinery with brand new machinery, maybe do an Italian-style bow extension, you could get it to be a really fast, can keep up with or even catch most heavy cruisers and kill them horribly. If you want to spend a bit more money, you could perhaps lose Q turret, that's the center turret, and make it even faster still, and or buy a bit more protection, more anti-aircraft and secondary guns, and so on and so forth. So you could make very useful anti-cruiser vessels, but their utility against capital ships, and thus their role in the battle line, would be pretty much gone. So they would therefore become priority for replacement, and in fact at that point the Japanese might take up either Fujimoto or Hiraga's historical Kongo replacement designs in the early 1930s and say, look, we've got to replace these things. They are, far behind the curve compared to everybody else. Yoko GMSTVH asks, I came across a video on YouTube of a Victorian-era pleasure craft being launched, and it was described as being one of the first times a ship had been captured being put into the water on film, as all others were captured in a still image. What is the earliest surviving film of a warship engaging in action, i.e. actually attacking an enemy vessel, not just showing off for the cameras? And what do we know of the battle and the vessel or vessels depicted? And what is the oldest still photographic image of a warship doing the same thing, and what do we know about that battle and ship? While I can't be 100% certain, I think the oldest combat photo of a warship that I'm aware of where it's actually legitimately firing in anger would be one of the set that I'm showing you at the moment. So this is the bombardment of Fort Moultrie towards the tail end of 1863 in the American Civil War, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is USS New Ironsides having just fired a salvo. There are a few other photographs of this engagement taken, but there's some taken like this from a beach by civilians, and there's one or two taken by a photographer who was actually in a Confederate fortification, and you can see the monitors, line of monitors firing. It's just a question of date-wise, this is ostensibly on the 7th. The photo of the monitors bombarding is ostensibly from the 8th, but there is some discussion about both of those dates. But this is going to be one of, if not the earliest, actual proper combat photo, at least as far as I'm aware of. As far as footage is concerned, I think the earliest undisputed film footage we have is from the First World War, I think from the Gallipoli Dardanelles campaign. There is a 20-ish second clip that wanders around the internet occasionally, which claims to be from the Sino-Japanese War in the late 1800s. However, I severely doubt that is the case, not just because, film camera technology in the 19th century for use aboard ships is a little bit primitive, but also because, you don't really see all that much in any great detail. It's very, very blurry, grainy, and jumpy. But what you do see, two things. Firstly, the ships you actually see even vaguely clearly seem to resemble more modern destroyers, i.e. destroyers with forecastle and a flare, rather than the whaleback type torpedo boats and destroyers, which were far more common in the Sino-Japanese War, which would mean that it's more likely to be early 20th century footage, perhaps Russo-Japanese War footage. The other problem is that little clip that you get of the destroyers is they're sailing far, 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 far too close together for it to be an actual battle. That's more, special maneuvers on film parade style formation distances. So, certainly there may be parts of it that are actual footage from at least probably the Russo-Japanese War, which would technically make it the oldest active footage we've got, but we don't even strictly know if it's war film, if it's which conflict it's from, and therefore the chances of telling you what ships are even in there are pretty much slim to none until more information comes forward. John Perkins asks, I can't visualize a paravane chain cutting another chain holding a mine to the seafloor. How exactly does this work? Well, there's a couple of important things to note first. Firstly, there is the fact that whilst common media might show you sea mines held to the sea bottom by chains, usually if there's any chain involved, it'll be a very short section attaching the mine, attached directly to the mine, but the vast majority of the mooring will be by a steel cable. For various reasons, when these things are chucked overboard with the little box underneath that pays out the mooring, it's much, much easier to have a spool of wire, and a spool of metal wire will go a lot further and be less likely to jam than a spool of chain, because chain has quite a lot of volume to it. And similarly with paravanes, although they can be towed on chains, they're very often towed on wires, as you can see here from an instructional manual from the Second World War. So to sever the mooring cable, you would end up with one of two things happening. Either the paravane attached to a ship moving at speed, therefore with a fair amount of kinetic energy, would be moving quick enough that the snagging effect might either rip the line out of the mooring box or off of the mine, or might tear the cable itself. And if that didn't happen, which bear in mind minesweeping tends to take place at slower speeds, then the mine and its mooring line would run down the wire, as you can see here, and at the end of the wire attached to the paravane, it would slide into a specialist wire cutter, which is attached to the paravane, and that would then sever it and release it, and the mine would pop to the surface, as again demonstrated here. In the event that the short length of chain did get caught up, then at that point, just again, the sheer kinetic energy and inertia of the paravane and the ship towing would probably break something, but it wouldn't be pretty for anything involved, because there'd be probably a reasonable amount of damage done to the paravane and or tow cable as well, depending on where the breakage occurs. I mean, if it just snags and then rips the cable out of the spool on the sea anchor at the bottom, then that's another matter entirely. And you can see here, I've switched over to show you a cross-section of a paravane, and you can see the cutter just there at the top left. John M. asks, HMS Garry sank UB-110. German sailors in the water attempting to surrender were shot by the Garry crew. Only after the convoy had been escorting hove into view did Garry half-heartedly lower boats to help. This seems to be a war crime. Why was Captain Lightoller given a bar to his DSC instead of being brought up on charges? There were two primary factors involved here. Firstly, at the time, you had two conflicting stories. The survivors of UB-110 said that the Garry had opened fire on them, and the crew of the Garry said the submarine sank and there were 13 guys on the surface and we picked them up. So, in the middle of war, especially a war as highly charged as the First World War, if the U-boat crew said one thing and the destroyer crew said another, then people were just likely to believe what the destroyer crew was saying and say, well, yeah, the Germans are clearly just making stuff up again, at which point it becomes a fairly standard, hey, you sank a submarine, well, that's relatively rare, so here, have an award for it. The other issue is this slightly legally grey area in which this all took place. Now, that is distinct from the moral area, because, you can make a pretty solid moral argument that the crew of UB-110, if they were shot at, should not have been shot at, and that this was morally wrong. However, according to international law at the time, unrestricted submarine warfare, which is what Germany was practicing at the time, was in and of itself a war crime. And how war crimes or people who are violating international maritime law are dealt with at sea varies quite considerably from on land. On land, within reason, you may be expected to arrest people and put them on trial, At sea, people who had effectively declared themselves, if you would want to use a medieval term, an outlaw at sea by violating the internationally accepted codes and laws of conduct at sea, had effectively made themselves pirates. And pirates were, legally speaking, still subject to being able to be summarily executed at sea. Depending on how you read the laws, that may not actually have been changed. But, this is the nature of actions at sea. So, technically speaking, by a very particular interpretation of the law, you could make an argument that the crew of UB-110, by taking part in what was at the time an unlawful activity, i.e. unrestricted submarine warfare, had therefore placed themselves outside the law or in violation of it, and therefore were pirates, and therefore, technically speaking, gunning them down out of hand was not a war crime. Of course, then you fast forward to the end of World War II, when Admiral Dönitz is put up on trial, and one of the big things that he's put on trial for is orchestrating unrestricted submarine warfare, which he's therefore charged with a war crime, because even in World War II that was a war crime, but he was found not guilty of that because the US Admirals, Nimitz, stood up and said, well, we were doing exactly the same, and are you going to put me on trial, essentially? And it's actually, unrestricted submarine warfare is a very interesting example of where something has actually been agreed to be against the law, to be an international war crime, but has been de facto and then later de jure changed to not be, by the fact that everybody is doing it, and everybody realizes, well, therefore you can't actually try people for it without trying your own people, so they change the law to make it legal. Now, as I said, from a moral perspective, more generally, if the crew of UB-110 were shot, they should not have been, and that was wrong of Lightoller to do. But, as I said, on the flip side, from a purely legalistic perspective, there may have been a case for it, although I don't think he was thinking along those lines. And from a more cultural perspective, U-boat crews were really, really hated back in World War I, more so than submarine crews generally would be later on. Again, doesn't justify it, but does serve perhaps as a degree of explanation as to why they would undertake such action in the first place, and why, if people even believed the UB-110 crew, they might be willing to turn a blind eye or think that they deserved it. Leon Wu asks, why did the British do the whole USS Robin exercise? It's not like Britain was a neutral power hiding their military involvement. The two were openly at war against the Axis, so why all the song and dance to disguise a carrier as an American ship? There's a few different reasons. The main ones are just operational security, because bearing in mind there is a limited number of Allied carriers, especially at the end of 1942. If the Germans or Italians can read British codes, and they see orders for HMS Victorious to be deployed over to the Pacific, then they know, one, the Victorious can't go and trouble them, and two, they can pass that information over to the Japanese, so the Japanese can anticipate and try and deal with that. And likewise, if the Japanese could read US codes or British codes, they might try and hunt down Victorious, or they might just pass that information back to the Germans and Italians, and you're back to the same position we explained previously, except just from a slightly different source. Whereas if you don't mention Victorious and you have USS Robin as her call sign, then anyone who's just doing a surface level breaking and reading of either American or British coding is not going to immediately recognize that this is in fact HMS Victorious, and thus operational security as to where exactly Victorious is maintained. TST 1987 asks, I was watching the video on Essex versus Phoebe and Cherub, and there was an amusing incident in which the ships were stuck in neutral waters at Valparaiso, and both ships hoisted passive-aggressive banners with political slogans directed at each other, and no doubt mixed in with some rather rude signal flags and hails. My question is, in the period that the channel covers, what, in your opinion, are the most amusing messages, banners, signal flags, etc. exchanged between two enemy combatant ships that, due to either bad weather or being stuck in neutral waters, are in clear conditions and have a clear full view of each other, but are unable to fight or bring guns to bear against each other? Unfortunately, there's not really all that many occurrences. The exchange between Phoebe and Cherub and Essex is actually not entirely unique, but almost unique, for two reasons. Firstly, the precise circumstances of two clearly hostile ships being within visual or shouting range of each other, but unable to further engage in combat due to weather or neutrality, was actually a relatively rare event. And when it did happen, the vast majority of conflicts in the Age of Sail were between nations which spoke different languages. And therefore, whilst, for example, on a French ship, there may be one or two officers who understood English, and likewise, there may be a few officers on a British ship who understood French or Spanish or whatever language, the chances are the vast majority of the other side wouldn't have the faintest clue what a banner in the ship's own language said, and so there was precious little point in hoisting something, especially because obviously if they didn't understand what was being said, the worst thing you could do would be try and cobble together something in said language, so a French crew trying to stitch together an English banner or an English crew trying to stitch together a French banner, because they'd almost certainly get something wrong, which would just make them look stupid. Although one of the memes you do see circulating around the internet is very amusing and actually true, if somewhat complicated. So that's Captain Peter Tordenskjold, I think that's how it's pronounced, who was actually a Danish naval commander flying a Dutch flag in a galley when he encountered a British galley that was supposed to be going to Sweden. So, yeah, try and work out all of that. And they end up fighting it out pretty much all day, overnight, and into the next morning. And then it kind of gradually peters out because, well, the Danish ship flying the Dutch flag has run out of ammunition. And then Tordenskjold sends an envoy over to the British ship and just asks, yeah, I'm out of ammunition. Could I borrow some of yours so we can keep fighting this rather excellent duel we've been having for the past 24 hours? And the British captain rather understandably says, no, I don't think I can accommodate that. But in the rather weird and wonderful spirit of the Age of Sail, having spent the better part of the last 24 hours desperately trying to kill each other, both crews saluted each other, played some music, drank to each other's health, and sailed off, having decided that it was they'd done their best, and that was pretty much all there was to it. The funny postscript to that actually is that Tordenskjold was then court-martialed because some of his opponents didn't like the fact that he'd not won the battle, but he basically. The long version is very, very complicated, but the short version is he turned around and said to them, well, you're accusing me of not having won a battle and having fought against a superior foe, as in, a bigger, more heavily armed foe, and also, come up with this rather silly paper accusation of passing over vital military information by telling the opponent I've run out of ammunition. And he then just went on a really epic rant, calling them all a bunch of useless cowards who would never have bothered to dare try and even fight, let alone, fight a superior opponent. And how dare they try and judge him for actually doing his job when they were sitting at home twiddling their thumbs. And it kind of went on like this for several hours. And then at the end of that, the king just kind of went, I like this guy's style. He is not going to be found guilty. In fact, he's going to get a promotion. Michael Gilson asks, building ships with the intention of later converting them into carriers seems to be something the Japanese did a reasonable amount, and I assume that other navies either did or considered it. More considered it than did. I also know it didn't work out so well, to a certain degree. And it always seemed to take longer than expected, and the results were less than desired. Yeah, pretty much. Would it have worked better if the ostensible design was for an ocean-going train ferry? These are already quite heavily reinforced, and you could make the train deck into the hangar deck. The decks above would be easily removable for the installation of a flight deck and island, and with some cargo holds for the installation, more engineering and fuel. Before conversion, it could then be generating economic revenue. In theory, the idea has a certain degree of merit. The problem, though, is that in order to do this kind of, covertly funding something that can be converted into a warship later on, which is a little bit different from putting mounting points in for guns to turn merchant ships into our merchant cruisers, which was more allowed, at least in parts of the early 20th century. The bigger problem is you've got to, because it's covert, work out a decent enough cover story. And a big, 15, 20, 25,000 ton ocean going train ferry, there really aren't that many calls for that kind of ship. On top of which, of course, the thing is with the ships that would eventually become Junyo and Hyo, which were the two of the Japanese ships designed to be converted, because they were ostensibly carrying at least some passengers in their civilian design, you could justify speed because passengers like speed. Whereas if you've got a train ferry, then, well, how are you going to justify this ship moving at a very high speed? Because, ferries don't usually do that. Plus, of course, you'd also have another issue, which would be the bow and stern would have to be very broad and flared to let the things on and off. So there might be a fair bit of reconstruction work that would need to be done there. So structurally speaking, yes, a train ferry probably would make a very good base because, as you say, it's got fairly low center of gravity, and it's got this big wide open space on it already that you can then just either pop a flight deck on, or maybe even pop another hangar deck on and then a flight deck or something like that. The bigger problem would be the wider justification of why exactly you've built a high-speed ocean-going train ferry. But what you might be able to get away with is a similar idea, but if you said you were building a high-speed mixed-use automobile and passenger ferry. This would assume that your country is actually exporting a reasonably large number of vehicles, whether those be cars, vans, trucks, tractors, or whatever. But you could, in theory, then build a similar kind of vessel with a very large, essentially multi-level hangar. Obviously, the individual hangar levels don't have to be particularly strong; they just have to support the weight of vehicles rather than aircraft and lots of bombs. But could, in theory, be carved out to provide taller hangars for aircraft. But the wonderful thing about that, of course, is that vehicles can drive up and down ramps, so you can mount the hangar higher in the ship, or the hangar levels. And by having passenger accommodation both above for first class and below for third class along with it, then you could justify it saying, well, look, we're making a high-speed passenger vessel that's going to run to and from various places, but it's also going to take our wonderful vehicle output for trade. And this is why it has to be a very large, very fast vessel with this very long internal series of hangar decks transporting many, many vehicles. And of course, extra special feature for the first class passengers, they can bring their vehicle over to whichever country they're going to. That would actually make a pretty decent aircraft carrier conversion and be slightly more believable than a high-speed ocean-going train ferry, unfortunately. Camino John asks, last month I asked about sailors' pay in the Age of Sail if they were killed in the line of duty. This month I'm curious about the onboarding process for Age of Sail personnel. What was the process when an average sailor or a professional like a quartermaster, master carpenter, etc., or an officer was posted to or enlisted on a ship? What could they take to their space and what had to be left behind and what had to be checked in? For example, let's say you're a sailor who still has a few shillings in his pocket. Do you surrender them to the ship's paymaster and an entry be made on the books? Or if you're an officer, do you surrender your pistols or other weapons except for your sword to the armory of the ship? To keep an orderly ship and minimize disruptions caused by theft or violence, I imagine there had to be protocols in place to avoid problems down the line. It is one of those questions where the answer can vary quite considerably depending on which century you're looking at and which nation you're looking at. But broadly speaking, for a British, American, Imperial, French, probably Imperial Spanish to a certain degree, but maybe not quite so much experience. But the broad experience, mostly, would be, firstly, do you have significant others ashore? Because if you've got stuff that, you might not want to take aboard the ship, and you have a wife or a close family ashore, then you can leave stuff with them and take the minimum aboard. Sailors normally would either have a bag or a sea chest that they would bring aboard, and all their stuff would be in there. Whether or not, if you had a few extra shillings, or dollars or whatever, you would surrender that to the ship's purser. You could, in some navies at some times, lodge money with the purser and then with a receipt get it back later, but more often you would just keep it on your person or in a locked sea chest if you happened to have one of those. Obviously there is a risk to that, but people preferred quite often to keep their money close to them, and that's actually something that continued all the way through, even into the Second World War, where you have instances of ships being sunk and sailors diving into the water, because obviously they don't want to drown, but then when they get to a lifeboat or they get rescued, they're suddenly very distraught because they might have had actually saved up quite large amounts of money in paper currency, which is now all soaked through and useless. And the better captains tended to make restitution for that, as long as there was still, evidence that the bills had existed at some point, even if they were a little bit of a sodden mess. But that's getting a little bit sidetracked. If you're an officer, you could bring as many weapons aboard as you liked. Weapons laws, such as they were at all at that point, pretty much did not care. If an officer just brought aboard his ceremonial sword, that was fine. If the officer brought along, 6 different swords for 6 different occasions, 4 pistols, 3 rifles, and a small cannon, this was also fine, as long as he stored them in the space that was allocated to him. You don't want random heavy ordnance rolling down the ship's passageways, after all. One of the main deterrents to theft and violence on a ship was partly the security offered by contingents of Marines, but partly also the fact that these things are not very large or very complex internally vessels when you're talking about an age of sail, frigate or ship of the line. There are only so many places you can go, and with the sheer number of people crammed into a ship, trying to steal something from, say, an officer's cabin or trying to pick the lock on one of your fellow sea chests is going to be noticed by a fair few people. And even if it isn't somehow, maybe when a bunch of people are ashore and it's nighttime or something, the property was usually going to be fairly identifiable. That's why people tended to carve their initials or some kind of mark into everything. And it's relatively easy to search the ship and find stuff. So, if you steal an officer's musket or a model that the guy 3 guns down on your gun deck has been working on or something like that, then you're probably going to be found out rather quickly. And that kind of breaking of the trust internally within the crew, you will get very severely punished. In fact, in a lot of cases, you would probably, if you're a regular sailor, want to turn yourself over to the officers, because the officers would mete out punishment according to the books. Your fellow sailors, if they thought you were a thief, in their midst, and therefore their stuff was also at risk, would probably be less merciful. And you've got to bear in mind that even if an initial search doesn't turn anything up, you've also got the idea that, especially in the age of sail, collective punishment is not frowned upon, as long as it doesn't taken to extremes. So, if the captain says, right, well, everyone is going to be swabbing the decks 3 hours a day until this item or this money is returned, you can guarantee pretty much fairly quickly the collective detective skills of the ship will work out who's responsible and make them turn it over. And with ships potentially being at sea for weeks or months at a time, again, if an initial sweep doesn't find something, it'll probably turn up sooner or later. You'd have to be really sneaky and really dedicated and willing to cause all sorts of ructions on the ship to steal a relatively small item and hide it away well enough for it not to be found, and then only use it when you get ashore. And is it really worth it? Probably not. But more broadly speaking, what you could bring aboard essentially depended on what space you had allocated to you. So obviously a ship's carpenter would bring aboard a fairly wide range of carpentry tools, but he had an entire office as well as a cabin, such as it was, to inhabit. The higher ranking officers had cabins as well, so again they could bring in even furniture and so forth, whereas the average sailor, it'll be what can he fit in a small sea chest or a sea bag, and that's and what is he carrying on his person. Scott Jennings asks, you've previously discussed ways in which HMS Hood could have survived her encounter with Bismarck. However, what would have had to happen in order for Hood to actually win that engagement? Is there any conceivable way this could have happened, short of Neptune himself reaching down and smiting Bismarck from on high? Yes, I would take there are two paths which you could take to perhaps getting Hood to win the Battle of Denmark Strait. One is just playing around very slightly with a few shell trajectories at the battle, and the other is a little bit more fundamental. So the more fundamental approach would be to change Hood's fire control system, because Hood's gunnery was not as good as Prince of Wales's gunnery in the Battle of Denmark Strait. That's just a fact. Now, the reason for that is that when Hood was launched, she was launched with the latest and greatest in fire control technology available, as was fitting for her role. That was the Dreyer Table Mark V, which was the culmination of the Dreyer tables, which had been, the Royal Navy's first experience in full fire control systems. However, she was never updated. And the subsequent ships that came into service, Nelson and Rodney, introduced a complete rework of fire control in the Royal Navy with the Admiralty Fire Control Table Mark I, which was much more in line with what you'd expect a fire control electromechanical computer to be like in the Second World War. And in fact, as I've mentioned in one or two previous Drydocks, the Admiralty Fire Control Table was seen as the single most advanced fire control system on the planet when it was first introduced, and would basically continue in that role, with numerous historians who have looked at it and fire control systems in general commenting on it, that essentially no one would have a system as good or slightly better until the Ford Mark I system was introduced on US fast battleships. And by that point, obviously, when you get to something like Prince of Wales, she has a further development of the Admiralty fire control computer. There's several marks all the way up to the Mark X, which is installed on Vanguard. So Prince of Wales' fire control system was actually quite good. And this is actually reflected in the battle, because even though Prince of Wales is a brand new ship and has all the issues with her guns that she has at that battle, she is actually the first vessel to score a hit on Bismarck, and first vessel to score a hit in the engagement by a considerable margin, and she scores more than one hit, which, isn't bad for given the lengthy laundry list of other issues she had. So it shows just how good her fire control system was. It was feeding in good, accurate data, and it was generating good, accurate results. And if Prince of Wales had managed to sustain having all 6 of her forward guns operating consistently throughout the battle, who knows what else she might have accomplished. So what I'm getting at with that is that whilst getting Hood fully modernized would be a very, a very great sidestep into alternate history, it's somewhat less of a sidestep to suggest that perhaps Hood could have been quickly refitted in the late 1930s with a new Admiralty fire control table system, because the Dreyer Table Mark V was actually a very big, cumbersome beast, and replacing it with an Admiralty fire control table of a mark contemporary with the King George V's wouldn't have actually cost a huge amount or been particularly complicated compared to full modernization. Now, if that had been done, then Hood's own gunnery probably would have been a lot better. Now, there were other issues, with the angle of approach and salt spray and everything, but just by having a much better fire control system, it significantly increases Hood's gunner's chance of scoring a hit. And given that Hood didn't have the same issues with her guns that Prince of Wales had with hers, and then looking at what Hood managed to do, it's not inconceivable that she would have landed several hits on her targets. Now, granted, initially she was shooting at the wrong target, but even so, then she shifts fire. It's possible that with hits landed on both Prince Eugen and Bismarck from Hood, as well as hits landed on Bismarck from Prince of Wales, that might then encourage the Germans to undertake a course change to try not to get hit quite so much. And if they do that, then that throws the variables of that one lucky shot, which means it probably doesn't happen. And as with most naval battles, he who gets the hits in first and keeps on hitting probably is going to win. So if Bismarck has taken like half a dozen hits from 15-inch and 14-inch shells, then she's now very much on the defensive. And if that hit that destroys Hood doesn't come about, and Hood and Prince of Wales have both managed to unmask their rear turrets, and they're now, at this point, definitely both shooting at Bismarck, you have 18 guns from good fire control systems pouring their fire into Bismarck. That's probably going to grind Bismarck down in a similar way to what happened to her historically facing off against Rodney and King George V, because, of course, once fire control systems start to break and fires start to break out and so on and so forth, her ability to shoot back is also significantly degraded. And the longer the battle goes on, the greater the chances are that Norfolk and Suffolk manage to catch up. And if they do, then they can either take Bismarck under fire from an unengaged angle, which is kind of what Dorsetshire did in the final battle with Bismarck, or they could go after Prince Eugen, which in this case may have been badly hit by a few 15-inch shells from Hood before she switches fire. So, yeah, in that scenario, having an Admiralty fire control table and associated systems might have allowed Hood to win. The alternate thing, so that's a much larger, sort of reaching several years back change. The other thing would just be sheer blind luck, because as we said, the first ship to score hits in that engagement was Prince of Wales. Now, obviously, historically, the hit to the bow, which then, caused the loss of access to fuel, which caused Bismarck to decide to head for home, but also caused leaks, and loss of speed, which allowed Bismarck to be trapped by Catalinas. All of that was very vital to the way everything historically played out. But if you just, as I said, play around a little bit with the ballistics and say, okay, well, instead that shell, instead of hitting low on the bow, is going to hit high on the superstructure, and you basically get a hit similar to that which historically has been attributed to HMS Rodney, basically splashing off the conning tower, crippling or killing most of the senior command staff, and quite possibly severing the connections for primary fire control or the primary rangefinder, or just take out the primary rangefinder for that matter, or take out the command and control stuff. One of the two. You don't have to do both, but since it historically happened with the 16-inch shell, if you kind of just juxtapose that with this scenario, although at the same time it would have to be a slightly different hit because of course the angles are different. So let's just say you take out one or the other. You either take out Gunnery Officer Schneider and primary rangefinders, or you take out the command crew with a rather solid hit to the conning tower early on with that early hit. Well, now Bismarck is in trouble because she's either not receiving orders until Officer Earls can take over from wherever it is he's got to at this point, or you've lost the ability to bring in fire control data from your primary rangefinder. You're having to switch to forward and aft rangefinders, and all of that introduces variables which again are almost certainly going to throw out the exact circumstances in which Hood gets her very, very unlucky hit. And then we're back to pretty much the same point we mentioned earlier, except Hood's not firing quite as accurately, but Prince of Wales is. They've both unmasked all their guns. You've now got your 18 guns, and Prince of Wales can fire whichever varying number of guns she's got operational at that time at a Bismarck, which is now, either trying to recover its command and control structure and or trying to re-establish fire control using secondary rangefinders or the backups. And that That lag, again, might allow Norfolk and Suffolk to catch up. Probably will allow even Hood's fire control systems to zero in and start landing hits. And then it's that gradual degradation down and down and down further still. Especially because if Prince of Wales starts landing multiple hits on Bismarck, then it would make a degree of sense for Bismarck to switch fire to Prince of Wales, because if she's the bigger threat, you need to get rid of her first, rather than, because if you don't get your spectacular one-shot detonation hit on Hood, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense to be shooting at the ship that's hitting you less and letting the ship that's hitting you more essentially get free target practice. So, yeah, there's two potential scenarios in which Hood and Prince of Wales could have won the Battle of Denmark Strait, but you can see just how much random chance is involved.